Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to this workshop of the Ceremony Valley Unified School District Board of Education. Today is Wednesday, March 9th. Call to order. Can you all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? And the record can show that we have all of our school board members present for this workshop. Can I have an acceptance to the workshop agenda, please?
So moved.
Second.
The motion was made by Board Member Bratt and seconded by Board Member Clark. Roll call vote, Board Member Clark,
Aye.
Board Member Bratt,
Aye.
Board Member Hurd,
Aye.
Board Member Mintz.
Aye.
Board Member Ordway.
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Great, thank you. So our main business today, 4.0, is board workshop. And that is our only business in today's afternoon session. So I'll kick it over to our superintendent to get us started.
Thank you, President Mintz. And again, the purpose of our workshop is for you to have the opportunity to have discussion around key topics in a public forum. No action is taken here. Just as a reminder to anyone who might be listening, that what staff will do is we will listen closely to the discussion. We will take notes regarding what we've heard. I may actually play back so that we ensure that we've heard properly. And then we'll bring it to you, any changes you wish to make in a board meeting so that you can approve it officially. So that would be the plan. And then in terms of our specific topics, you can see in the agenda that we want to speak about work that you've been engaged in for a little while in groups of two, which of course is certainly permitted under the Brown Act, whereby our the board's advocacy and the handbook would be the start of our discussion. And then we wanted to move into any discussion you may wish to have regarding aspects of our bylaws related to our board meetings to see if any adjustments, clarifications, or additions, etc., need to be made. So that is our plan going forward. And I believe that for the two board member kind of directed items, you all know who's going to take the lead on those things, the handbook and the advisory process. Cindy, did I get that right? Okay. So
Okay, so we're not going to be surprised. I'm going to take the lead on the So first, let me thank Trustee Bratt, as well as Terry Caney, who was very supportive and helpful in what at times was our rambling conversations, and he was able to pull those together into notes. And thank you to the rest of the staff that then helped him to edit and refine. Have all the board members had an opportunity to review the draft plan that we have in front of us? Should have skimming it. Okay. One of the things that I do want to make clear is for our workshop today, we're not looking to wordsmith our documents, but really at a more of a conceptual basis to make sure that, you know, if there's a particular topic or direction that we seem to be going, and if there's questions about that, I think that's where we want to focus our attention today. As you all recall, as Dr. Malloy mentioned, a couple of areas that we were hoping to create better practices around and even policies are advocacy and communication as a board, and then our preparation for board members. So that'll be the second part then. So the first one, we're entitling Community Engagement and Advocacy Plan. And as you can see from our goal, our focus really is to make sure that we're in a position to advocate strongly as a board for public education, and particularly within our own community. And as part of that, educating our community as well as receiving input from our community so that they're engaged in the process and not being done to them, but with them. Because as board members, we represent our community. Um, uh, Other than that, as you can see, the document was broken down into the types of results, the purpose, why are we doing this, key messages, who our audience and stakeholders are, strategies and delivery channels, um, and um, what I would point out specifically about this is that uh, we're not trying to create a singular pathway, and this is what we each have to do as board members, but really as a collective body, hopefully what we and future boards can agree to in terms of how we want to conduct ourselves as a group. Because as everyone knows, and this is more for the public, each of us individually hold no authority. It's only as a board, and it's in our role as community servants, as it were, that we hold these positions. I don't have a lot that I wanted to get into specifically, but I did want to open up for conversation about the direction we're going. The one other thing I would mention, though, is I believe that from what we've done so far, this document aligns very strongly with the work that's also going on with our Access to Excellence program. We're really focusing on education of the community, our outreach to the community, as well as feedback opportunities from the community. As you all know, we have a tremendous school district. Academically, our students are first rate. We have a tremendous staff and tremendous community support. And what we want to do is make sure that we continue to align all of those pieces together. Our parents, our staff, our community at large that doesn't even have students in the school, which is a group that we normally leave out a lot of our conversations that's going on. So the hope is that this document and our implementation of it will help to bring everyone together. And so when we have issues come up, we can talk as a singular voice for the community. It's not to say there won't be disagreements and conversation, but hopefully as we have different voices in the room, we'll come up with a better solution going forward as opposed to just one voice just saying this is the way it ought to be. So anyway, those are kind of my opening conversation for this one. I'm just going to turn over to Laura to make some comments as a co-conspirator to this part.
Yeah, if I could just kind of piggyback and add. In building this out, one of the things that I think we looked to was really creating a toolbox and framework for board members to be able to have the resources to communicate effectively as well. So giving us individually and then also as a governing body different platforms to be able to speak to speak about the issues that we need to speak about, to bring in the community so that we can have that back and forth and create those pathways. So that was, I think, from my perspective, that was one of the core reasons for building out this document as well. And like Ken said, it was a lot of brainstorming and a lot of talking about where the needs lie and then building up from those needs. And so that's kind of the baseline of this document.
Yeah. The other thing I would add is the reason for doing this now, I think is recognition that we're in a changing environment. And if you go back a few years, we put out like an insert to the Times quarterly years ago. And that's how a lot of the community would know about generally what was happening in the school district, particularly if you didn't have kids in the school district. You look at today's environment, and if you're of a certain age, probably the only news that you get is social media related. A lot of people don't look at the newspaper the same way that they used to, so we haven't provided that source. So finding new ways of communicating with our various stakeholders in the community is going to become really important. That it's not a one-size-fit-all type approach when we look at the various groups that we want to communicate with. And I'd say first and foremost on that is our students. It's a group that we really haven't done as much direct participation with our direction in the past, but with our student board members, student senate, I think there's a renewed interest in getting that student voice here to the table on particular topics that directly impact them, that otherwise we might hear from them as an alternative after the fact type of thing. So it's really important to start engaging them up front, but that's not to limit what we want to hear from the families as well as our staff members as well. So go ahead,
So if I
Rachel.
go?
Yeah, please. do.
So I appreciate what you both shared there because that's context that kind of helps me understand intent. As I read the actual document, I found myself getting a little bit confused about a board communication plan or advocacy plan versus how does that fit with the whole district? And then that becomes very challenging in my own mind about how if we can't even all weigh in on a letter we're writing to the governor, how do we then create communications that represent 5 people's views without spending entire board meetings trying to write them? So it's the mechanics and really kind of questioning, should the school district have a separate communication plan rather than how do we fit into the district's plan? Like some of the examples of, I like the idea of the insert, but should the insert maybe be coming from the superintendent's voice? Or if it should be the president of the school board, great, but it just, I think it's really important that the district is communicating to the community as one voice, one set of strategies, and not two worlds, two sets of leaders, I guess. Does that make sense?
One thing, just because I wasn't clear enough at the beginning. So obviously this is focused on your advocacy and how you might communicate. What I've asked our team to do is to be sure that whatever you land on becomes a part of the community engagement strategy that Alana's working on right now, and the communication strategy that Alana's working on right now, and the team. So it won't be separate from, but I think so no, I wouldn't worry about that today. You decide, I think, how you feel comfortable moving forward, and then we'll kind of figure out how to ensure that you're connected appropriately, effectively. The other piece that you are, I think, alluding to, and this is something that our F3 colleagues did help us with, is that when you have a public discussion and you give clear direction regarding what you want to see, then the challenge becomes if we were to use a strategy where after you give that direction, then it's my job with the team to fulfill it. The president or you all or me or all of us sign something, where we get ourselves into challenge is if we were then to be going back and forth on that away from the public. So I think that was the lesson that we learned from our F3 colleagues, and I'm looking to Namita to be sure I got that correct. So I think that there's no problem with you all signing something. There's no problem with you determining that I'm going to sign something, or that the president and I are going to assign something, because you discuss all of that when you're giving the direction. It just then means that there has to be the trust that we're going to fulfill it, we. And if we don't get it actually right, well, then we'll have to deal with that. But that would certainly be our intent to deliver it that way. That I think, I don't know if that answers your question or muddies the waters more, or.
I think it still creates a whole lot of room for confusion. I can see the board having a role in specific parts of the district's communication plan, but I'm a little uncomfortable with us having our own separate communication plan.
Well, and I guess I didn't think of the intent of this as a framework for us to have a consensus on what we were speaking about and then speaking out as a governing body, but more as a framework for each of us. We're each elected individually, but then we come into a governing body, right? So we still are communicating as individuals to the community, but in order for us to work as a governing body, we have to kind of have the same framework and the same toolbox in a sense, at least an understanding of that, right? And so I don't see this as a mandate for us to always have consensus when we speak out to our community, but more as tools for us to be able to do that effectively and work together as a governing
So
body
you're
effectively.
kind of looking for a conduit that would allow you to speak as Laura Bratt, trustee, district area, blah, 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 being an advocate for education, but not intruding on that, I'm speaking for the board part, really a way to separate the two.
Yeah, I mean, at times will be, if I'm at Cal graduation, I'm representing the board. If I'm at at Lead Across America, I'm representing the board, not just representing myself. But so this kind of gives us, the framework to be able to have the resources that we need to be able to do that, but it's not about deciding it.
I think there's the opportunity for both. And I think what we need is to make sure, and not for our current board necessarily, but we're looking forward as well, that there is a difference between when you speak as an individual and when you speak as a member of the board. And we've seen that in some cases in the past. So we want to make sure that we're clear, particularly on areas like advocacy, that if we're going to be taking a position as a board, we need to have a framework for how we even decide what we want to advocate and then the process we might go through for advocating. That doesn't preclude individual members in their own voice for advocating. The difficulty would be if the board decides one thing and individual board members were to go in an opposite direction, for instance, well, hopefully that would lead to even more conversation as a board to make sure that we're sending a clear direction for the community. But it may also point out where there are differences and differences that we would need to bring up and deal with as a board.
So I guess as I was reading it, I was looking at certain bullet points as almost like action items.
Mhm.
And, we'll engage the community about, whatever, we'll do that. That seemed to me like that was duplicating efforts that the superintendent and team would be doing to engage the community, or we should be doing those things together, but that it's an action item for us to do it
It's
seems like it's on their turf.
it's an action item within that bigger picture.
Yeah, it's a
So if you looked
collaborative.
at the bigger picture as being the district and its approach to communication and engagement, and then one subset of that is the board's participation as a group as well as individually.
That
As a
I'm
group, it's
comfortable
a
with,
policy
but as a
making
separate document
individually. Right.
is what I'm struggling with.
And it may be that this part of it fits into the overall
Okay.
access to
So-
excellence piece.
Or the communication plan that.
Yeah, so I will also offer this. Before you're seeing this, I sat with Alana and Tammy in the communications department and said, you're going to be doing 3/4 of this. Because even though there's a specific piece that's you, there's all kinds of things that you need to be comfortable with aspects that emerge through this conversation being part of the communication plan that isn't finalized yet. Conversation will allow, I think, you to determine if you're comfortable with the concepts. Then I would suggest with this particular piece, then we would incorporate those into one strategy. And everywhere I've been prior, there is always what the board does, what the superintendent and the cabinet does, what school site leaders do, like those kinds of, and not in a rigid way, but that kind of clarity regarding anything strategic, I've always seen having really positive benefits. So before it even came here today, Laura and Ken, working with Terry, sent it to me. We sat with it to be sure that there wasn't something that we were uncomfortable with, not because it was a bad idea, but because we just didn't know how we would do it. Because we know that this is really our job to support the whole district, and in particular in this conversation, you to do this well. So anything you decide will be incorporated, as long as that's okay with all of you, that's kind of how I'm reading what we're doing here today.
That helps me a lot.
Yeah, to give you a sense of what Dr. Malloy's talking about, we had just seen an edited version to this just the last couple of days. So what we had originally drafted went to staff, and staff made a number of positive changes.
Yeah.
I appreciate all of the work that they put in to helping to hone it down and make sure that it does align with other work that's underway.
Yeah, and I keep reiterating this, but I see it more as like a roadmap. So I think about like when I stepped onto the board and I didn't really have a full understanding of where I fit in as trustee Brat from a communication standpoint outwardly as well as inwardly. And this kind of, I see this as something that would have really been helpful for me, and it's will be helpful for me in the future. But in terms of, okay, we've discussed this. I feel that it's important to make sure that that so and so, but Assemblywoman Rebecca Bauer Kahan or so and so is is involved in this as well. Where do I go? How do I do this? So it's those kinds
So
of
it kinda
things
how you
too.
Amplify.
Yeah,
some
exactly,
things.
exactly.
And that's also where there's a lot of overlap with the handbook too,
Yeah,
Right,
right? With
exactly.
Chicken and the egg. kind
And you
of
kind of hope that these all will fit together.
yeah.
Shelley, Susanna, any thoughts that you want to
Well, I think
put forward?
a lot of the ideas in here are really great. And it's a little bit overwhelming reading it because there's so many things. And
And
I'm
there
like,
is some overlaps within the document itself as well.
true. And there is some overlaps we'll talk later with the governance handbook, which is probably a good thing because it looks like they dovetail pretty well. So I think some of it is going to be about what the mechanics are of actually executing this. So that will be the next step I think that we need to look at. But I'm really encouraged and impressed with what you created. So thank you for all the hard work on that. I think community outreach, we haven't been able to do it because of COVID, and it's one of the things that I like to do most. So having all of this information, as I'll piggyback on what Laura said, and that is, as a new trustee, this would have been incredibly helpful for me to have because we have so many constraints in the way that we can communicate with our community because of the Brown Act and other things. So when you come in new, you're like, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't do this, or should I do that, or maybe I shouldn't say that. So this really would help if we had more of a unified way to be able to address some of this stuff, and a unified way to be able to reach out to our community and have some different ideas about how to do that. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. This shows a lot of work. I've been doing this, and even though I'm not a new trustee, um, I found this. Wow, this would have been so much easier if I had this right when I stepped in 4 years ago, and because you know some of this, yeah, it's confusing and it's you don't know, right, as a new person. So I think that with this handbook, the strategies and stuff like that, it really kind of gives a framework that you're not going to get yourself in trouble, because what I found was it took me a little bit in order to do some of these things because I didn't know, what under the Brown Act and all that stuff, what could be done. So I was a little bit more, I think, hesitant in doing, some of the communications, kind of jumping in right away. And I think this is going to be very helpful. Yeah.
When I look at, and Shelley just mentioned, the last couple of years here, John and I were at the Seminole Valley High Feeder Band Festival out on the field last night. And as it turned out, the last live performance of one of our music groups was that on March 10th of 2020, 3 days before we went into lockdown. And now they were the first ones to have a live performance. And what was neat about that was, even when John got up to say just a few welcoming remarks, really first opportunity for him to be seen in person, in public, no mask, and for people to really see and hear him live. And it's something that all of us as board members have also lost the opportunity for in the last couple of years. So again, it's almost a new opportunity for us as a board to be representing the district and being able to get out there and be at events, but also having some talking points, the elevator speech type of thing, of the key issues that people are concerned about or that we would want people to know about. So I think that's where a document like this really helps, is to form that framework to be able to re-engage with the community. Because the other thing, just jokingly, when I meet with other local officials, city council members and others, school board members are usually the most anonymous of the group. You know,
Mhm.
people don't normally spend a whole lot of time knowing who their school board members are. That's probably changed a little bit the last couple of years. Um, and even more of an opportunity for us to get out there and make sure that we're able to deliver the kind of messages that's important for this community to know about what's going on in our educational community.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to know that this allows us as board members to partner with the school district and the communication team and use the communications team for resources. So have that collaboration that, honestly, while it existed to a certain extent, there wasn't it, it wasn't set up in a way that it was easy to be able to have that collaborative experience in terms of communicating out to the public. So knowing as a board member that I have that the district office communications office has given me these opportunities, and so then now I can fit the opportunities that fit into my calendar, and I can go out and do them instead of me standing and saying, okay, I really want to do this, so how do I find out about the music festival at San Ramon Valley? Well, I guess I can bug John, so this kind of gives us that the resources and the framework to be able to really do a key part of our job, which is relating to and communicating with the public and listening to them in a more effective way. So,
If I can just add one more thing to that, we talk about collaboration, that also goes to our stakeholder groups. And particularly those key stakeholders in the community that our district has had a tremendous history in working with the town of Danville, city of San Ramon, the fire district, even the county with Candace Anderson's office, PTA, a very strong synergistic connection. And knowing that and helping those other groups know what's going on with us makes them key advocates for us as well. And I think that's tied into this document, as well as, again, the work that we're doing with the Access to Excellence, is really making sure that we've delivered that message in such a way that we get some buy-in from them. So it's not just us trying to deliver the message that everyone would expect us to be delivering, but it's others in the community who have a strong voice to also be able to deliver those same messages.
And I really like the idea that this is coming from a district communications team coordinated effort about the messaging, rather than a lot of past practice where it was all about the person and the person in the seats, their connections and who they had lunch with and things like that. Whereas this is more equal, actually,
yeah,
shared.
right.
This is kind of in the weeds, but we were kind of joking about it as we sat down. It might be helpful if we could even get to something as routine as when you're inviting all 5 board members to something, you send a Google invite. And then we can respond yes, and you can see who's coming. And then if it's becoming an issue that too many of us are coming, there's an easy conduit for changing the game plan, rather than us having to read the Friday update and move 5 different things to our calendars. And this way, it's one event, and if it changes for all of us. I just think it would be so much simpler.
Well, and I would think too, as Alana and her team are developing a communication plan, that having this document will allow them to then fit us into the plan, and with that create resources and ways to better communicate and deal with the logistics of amplifying out the communication message and using us as board trustees to help to amplify that message.
And I think also not having our site managers feel concerned about
Yeah.
having us show up at something that
Yeah, they can see
hopefully
right on it.
Who's coming?
willing,
Yeah, that's true.
and feeling good and comfortable with our presence, and even hopefully as a helpful assist for us to be present. Anything else about this? And again, there may be some wording type of things. If there's anything like that, I'm sure you can get it back to me if you'd like, and I'll work back with staff on it, and we can continue to gel this document.
There's one item in there that I think is a really good thing to have thought of, and that was this idea of prior to election cycles holding an informational meeting. That's
Mhm.
been done, but kind of comes up, oh, we ought to do this, kind of last minute. So I think it's really good that got captured. district's to-do list and not the board's,
Right.
because just reading that, that seems really hard for the board members to be going, oh, come, just the dynamics of that is
Yeah.
a little strange. But really good that it was captured and remembered that that's, something that should happen.
I think the key on that one is the timing of when's best to do something like that. Because if you do it too early, you might miss some folks who are considering. If you do it too late, it might not have the same impact on helping people make that decision.
Yeah, and I think, oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay, just to that point, if I may. And because depending upon the dynamics of a situation leading up to an election, that can also be challenging on the district side too. So this is a discussion I'm bringing up at the county level with other superintendents as well. There may be some ways to do this kind of orientation to the role and such that is helpful, healthy, has its own local piece, because I know we did it last time, but there are also some challenges inherent in it too. And I'm just letting you know that I'm having those discussions broader than just here.
And it is interesting because at the city municipal level, the election is all kind of managed by the clerk, the city clerk, whereas for the school district, it's all done through the county. So there might even be a role for the county to, this is how you run for school board, and you hold an informational meeting related to the strategic directions and
Yeah, and to give credit where credit's due, that was actually Tara Lynn who gave me that idea to start advocating. So I have to give credit that it wasn't my idea.
And I'll throw a side idea on this, again, from a brainstorming perspective. Possibly even the CCCSBA might be a good place to house something like that. And even though it's board members, if it's not a direct, okay, you're talking to the board from which that person's running, but getting a board member experience across the county might have some value as well.
Yeah, and I,
Say to our representative to the CCC.
Yeah, it gets, it's interesting being on a representative there, because when we have events, almost every time all 5 of us attend. That is unusual when you look around. Two or three, lucky to get one from some. So you have to also, when you include that, you have to be careful about voice controlling things.
Right.
And
True.
person happens to be up for election, how good are they gonna be at, really
True.
voting? So again, I almost wonder if that separation to be
Yeah.
like through the Mackey's office or something like that actually.
yeah, and I think that to the point, a big part of this list came from needs and wants rather than from, a mandate of this is what we have to have, so it's more, these are the needs that we have as board members. Now, how can we have them facilitated so that we can be effective board members? So,
Anything else on this topic? Great. Then I guess we'll move on to the handbook. And who is going to give?
That would be me.
Thank you.
So I want to say a big thank you to Cindy because she kept us on track and kept editing for us. And that was a big part of the job and helped us with our ideas. And of course, Rachel, who has so much more experience than I do and was really so valuable in this process. So I thought about I don't think we've had a governance handbook before, or at least I haven't seen one. So I was thinking about anybody listening, what a governance handbook is. And I found a definition that I liked, so I wanted to read it before we start. The governance handbook reflects the governance team's work on creation of a framework for effective governance. This involves ongoing discussions about unity of purpose, roles, norms, and coming to agreement on protocols for formal structures that enable the governance team to continue to perform its responsibilities in a way that best benefits all of our students. So I think that kind of explains a little bit about what this document is about and what we're trying to accomplish with it. So we can just go ahead and dive in. We're still obviously in the edit phase. So our table of contents isn't quite up yet. But the first part, so what we did in sort of coming to this document was that we looked at a lot of other school districts who have governance handbooks and what they had included in them. And right I think we've kept it pretty simplified, more, not bare bones, but there was a lot of them that were much more detailed that kind of got a little overwhelming. So we can always add, but I think we have a good start on what it is that we need. So the first portion of it is meeting guidelines and norms, and also mentioned there is that we adopted the Rosenberg's Rules of Order. So I'm not sure whether we want to actually include those in the governance handbook, or if we want to just refer to them. Might be a good idea to have a page where we show what they are, at least. That would be great. So basically, we came up with these norms about, basically about how we treat each other in behavior in meetings. So if you want to take a look at those, if there's any that anybody wants to add, just jot them down. And then we come to board agenda, and basically it's what we're basically doing now. A trustee can request an item to be put on the agenda, and when they're prepared, questions regarding agenda items, how our consent agenda works, copies of the board agenda backup and other materials, and letting people know how and where they can find those. Then we have our meeting protocols. And basically that's how a meeting would be conducted when there is an agenda item, and how the president would pass it to a staff member. And how the process would go. Basically, we do the discussion, and we also put in a part in there about the board president will call on the trustee if they have indicated they have something to say versus going down the line, which I like to have in there because I think it is more collaborative rather than putting people on the spot, like at the end of the table or whatever. Talks about the student board member. The one that we are probably going to have to make a change on is the last one, under regular board meetings shall be adjourned by 10 p.m. unless extended to a specific time. The meeting shall be extended no more than once. Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, we went over.
So we're going to have to revise that maybe to have some different verbiage about if it needs to be extended more than one time, because that's certainly happened quite a bit. Says a little bit about closed session and that it's confidential, and some of the topics that come up under closed session. And we are gonna, on the board roles, we're going to reference those specific roles and put that in there. That just isn't in there yet. Basically talking about how we have rotation of leadership and how that is handled. And then we put a section in there, and I think, Rachel, you may be able to speak to this, because I think that you had some verbiage that you put in there when a new trustee is elected.
Yeah, and that's just putting in writing what has been the historical past practice, and shouldn't just go off, remembering how we've done it, and we've had people change in Cindy's seat, and, no surprises. So it's right there how it's handled. And that, I think, reflects what Ken and I have both experienced, and then we've gone from there.
Did you want to go through the whole thing before getting into individual conversation on some of these?
Yeah, it's not that much.
Sure, why
longer.
don't you go ahead?
Yeah, and then just make a note of whatever.
Sure.
So affiliate with school board associations. So basically this outlines what organizations that we're affiliated with, and it also talks about new trustee training and the availability of that we're part of CSBA and CCSBA. School visits. We have a process in place now where school board members email the supervisor for that particular school. We also added in there about trustees will be cautious about encroaching on administrators' time, and trustees will avoid evaluative commentary. Trustees will observe visitor protocol and wear badges and also sign in. I thought that was important because we may, for future boards, to know that we need to be respectful of the time of the administrators when we come for a visit. So that was something that was added in there. Communication, we don't have a lot in here about communication specifically, but since your document covers a lot of that, we covered the basics about, we have an email and a phone number, and if communication is addressed to, which has been our practice, but I think it's spelled out so that now people can understand it, about if an email is addressed to the superintendent and the board, the superintendent will answer and the president will answer on behalf of the board. Social media, we have a lot of information in here, and I don't know if you access the legislation when you put this in.
If not, we will add that. And before we take this to the board for action, our F3 team will be reviewing it.
Okay, perfect.
It also seems like some of the specifics from the plan that the other committee worked on would logically fit in here, things that create guardrails, right? Because that's what this document is, it's creating our guardrails.
And then we're down to, just explains about board member reports and what we actually report about. Public comment on both agendized and non-agendized items. Basically, it's what we're doing now, and I think we took some of that out of our existing verbiage that we're using. The only thing that I'll see down at the bottom is says public comment can be limited to less than 3 minutes. That probably should get moved up to under the public comments section rather than down at the bottom hanging by itself. It seems out of context there. Okay, new trustees, it just talks about what we do for new trustees, what kind of training, what documents we want to deliver, what information we want them to have. And then we're going to link a map to the trustee areas. And of course, our board meeting schedule. And then we have attached here the whole public comment section from our webpage. So we'll have to consolidate that. Okay. I think that's it for me. I had a couple switches of some sentences and things like that, but we can talk about that after.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I really appreciate, I think all of us do, the time and effort into getting these things down on paper, because it really helps to have it, but also something for reference point going forward as well. So I think that's excellent. We open up for comments and questions about the handbook. Go ahead, Flavia.
I have just a couple thoughts. There was a wordsmithing. It has Cindy's name in it, and I think that would probably be good to just have it be more generalized.
Yeah.
And then with school visits, if there's, and just the idea, just throwing this out there, of putting in some verbiage around school events as well, how we manage that as board members. And then communication with staff. So, we have, my understanding right now, and we've talked about this in other workshops, is that if I wanted to have a conversation with Deb Pettish about the math pathways, I would first reach out to Cindy and John, and then there would be then the meeting would be set up. I couldn't just board member. I can't just reach out to I don't know, let's say Jenny Hanau and say, I'm really concerned about there not being a bridge for geometry that we're providing, right? Like that's not something that I can do as a board trustee. That's not something I should do. And so having an understanding as a new trustee and just in the governance manual of how, as an individual board member, we communicate our ideas or talk about policy things in a way that's effective as opposed to that creates an issue.
That's super important. I thought we had talked about it. Maybe we didn't actually get it into the draft.
And if I can add that, because I always appreciate healthy relationships that exist between board members and staff, that what you sometimes receive from me after you just give me the heads up is, feel free to connect with so-and-so, because what I'll do is just close the loop so that we're all good. And it's not to try to be anything but just kind of keeping things moving healthily and positively, because, you know, by just in looping my office, Cindy and me in, it just can allow us also to facilitate things. So I'm just grateful to see that. But as you know, I don't always hold rigidly to that. Like sometimes I just say, don't worry about that. Just call Deb directly or call Christine directly, because that I also think is important after we've had that initial conversation. So.
Well, and I think it's, sorry, and I think it's having that understanding in here that as a board member, I don't, the district isn't my staff. Like I rely on Cindy to help support me in certain aspects and reach out to you with any questions that I have. But it's your staff, not my staff. So creating that understanding in the governance manual so that it's clear.
Well, I think it's a key point, particularly when we look at this as a new board member type of thing too. Again, it gets back to, each of us individually have no authority, only when we're sitting as a full board. That when we're reaching out to staff, we're not giving direction. We're looking usually for clarification and personal education so that we're prepared for the conversations and the direction that we need to set as a board. So I think that's really important. To the other point that you brought up about events and things, the other thing that might be important to put in here is that, yes, there's the Brown Act and there's the, making decisions, as a full board, not 2 members, not 3 members. At the same time, there's nothing that says we can't all be at an event together, but we need to take personal responsibility to ensure that we're not discussing business or potential business of the board when we are together.
So do you think maybe it should be a separate heading that says something like attendance at events, and then it covers how you get invited to school events, but also, I mean, that's why we can all go to CSBA, we can all go to another thing, and it clarifies what you're referring to.
Yeah, I think it's really good that, number signed up for going to different of the music festivals, for
But
instance, but there's
the art
nothing that would have
exhibition.
precluded us from all being there, for instance, or all being with the GSA forum later today. Those are things that make sense for us to participate in as individuals, but also showing, the continuity of the board as well. So again, just a way of weaving that into the document would be helpful.
And we do have language in a board bylaw that we can link to.
Perfect.
I wonder, related to what you were talking about at the beginning of the comment about the staff working for the superintendent. I mean, I wonder if in this document, we should have the piece about the board, our only employee is the superintendent. I wonder if we should be that clear
Yeah.
and then roll into,
I think so. I think the roles, I think a lot of people get confused with roles, our roles, district roles, and like what, I still get questioned, like, what does school board member do, And so I think clarification on that would be good. And I know, usually if I have a question or something for staff member, I might, I might not always, every time, talk to John first, right? Dr. Miller first, and then, go through that channel. I might reach out to staff if I just have a question. I'm not setting a direction or anything, question, but I always copy you, right? So that that I'm asking that question. And it's only because I don't want to, again, right, overstep or kind of leaving you out of the loop on information.
and we have this category board roles, so maybe we should even begin with those things, and then the rest of them are more like, office positions and the roles during the meeting, but start with big picture of what the job is.
Yeah, I was going to suggest the same.
Yeah, and clarifying operations versus governance, I think in that.
Right.
Because this guidebook has more than one audience. It's the
Yes.
users, the new people in the role, but it's also communities to set
Yes.
expectations about what that is.
And if I could just add that I think this is so healthy because when you said it best, President Mintz, when you said asking a question so that you can better understand something is way different than using an inappropriate avenue to give a direction. Because you started this meeting by saying, your authority is here. And then you discuss, you debate, and you dialogue, and you direct. And then, of course, I and the team have a responsibility to implement. So I am very comfortable, and I so much appreciate the copying sometimes, because I oftentimes connect with you more. So when I see the copy, I can make a connection with that person and say, so just to give you a little bit of feedback, it might help Laura to understand in that, because you don't want to put all of that, you're not going to write long emails. And so I just think it's healthy and it's helpful. It also, in the way you're speaking, it just reminds not only board members, but our team, the community, how your leadership works and then how my leadership relates to yours. That's very misunderstood commonly across everywhere I've been, not specific to any one community. So the fact that we're trying hard to clarify that, I think, is exceptional and healthy and important. So I want to thank you for doing it too.
No, that's very important. And we have to say that we're not part of the city council too. Again, one of those things that comes up, people don't understand our role. But I think
May I just jump in
Yeah.
for 1 minute to
No, please.
engage and encroach on this really helpful conversation? But I just wanted to reorient the remark that Trustee Hood made, that the only employee that the board has is the superintendent. That's not legally accurate. You employ everyone that works in the district. I think the better way to frame that is that you only direct the superintendent. And so with that, yes, that's all. Thank you.
Because otherwise we wouldn't do those two reports every
Yeah.
consent agenda.
You've got a whole lot more work than you thought.
Can I add just one more kind of thought, a separate thing? So in I think it was the ending part where it was kind of the onboarding, the idea, this is just an idea I'm throwing out, but the idea of a new trustee having a connection with a sitting trustee, a mentor, maybe we wouldn't go as far as use the big word mentorship, because that might imply things, but having that, giving the new trustee an opportunity to connect with another trustee prior to coming into the boardroom, that first time and getting sworn in, and then having a December 15th meeting that was a lot of fun. It would be very helpful to just kind of have a little bit of an on-ramp in terms of what to expect in the boardroom. And I think having a structured connection with a sitting board trustee would be helpful, if that's something that legally is possible. And
I think the caveat here is going to be that you're talking about the process and not the substance. So if the conversation in those orientation meetings is, okay, we comply with Rosenberg's rules versus Robert's rules, that kind of conversation is appropriate. But I think if you start getting into, our biggest issue is discipline at this particular site, I think you run afoul of the Brown Act.
More procedural in nature.
I almost wonder if it could just be done in a less formal way. I mean, I think typically people who run for the board have come to meetings, they see how it works, but you can always pick up the phone and call somebody and say, but I guess we need to also listen that you just walked this walk, and we need to be responsive to the needs that you felt that you had. I just worry about the formality of it looking like you're creating factions.
Yeah.
And if I can add that, even though what we in my office cannot do is share the actual experience, which I think can happen informally, we certainly, Cindy and I, and in a broader way, Alana and Tammy as well, we see that as a significant supportive role that we are playing too. So in other words, you're right, can't fill in what we haven't been, but we can certainly assist with governance, process, how things need to work, and all of that kind of thing. Because we also have the benefit of other resources that we can draw upon. Like we have some in the room right now, but there are others as well that we can help. So I just think that I will say that in the time I've been here and in the work I ask Cindy to do on our behalf, I've tried to really raise that up pretty explicitly as important so that you can do your work effectively. So
I remember we talked about, Shelley and Cindy, when we were working on this, that awkward time between the election and then those weeks until the election gets certified. And many times it's clear the day after the election who won, but in this last go round, it took a while. And so we talked about writing down how that works, and I don't remember seeing if we actually got it written in there. But so that there's some kind of communication coming from the superintendent's office. You're not just like, out there in the wilderness for 3 weeks kind of thing. So do you remember that conversation?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is that limbo period because also in the middle of all that is the new board member training at CSBA.
Mhm.
And whether you go or not that first time, or, it's unfortunate that it is immediate before everything's actually even been certified necessarily. So I know the same thing happens with Congress, where they have their new Congress member orientation and who goes to Washington when there's a close election.
Both better book a ticket.
Exactly. So you show up.
We'll let
only
you
to
know who
find
gets
that
to sit down.
and in fact, maybe they both sit down and one of them ends up not getting the seat. So that would be kind of awkward too.
I would just say, just suggest that there are districts that actually build that kind of language and expectations regarding outreach to potential new members as part of the orientation packet. Uh, so you're putting them on notice up front. Listen, the election is not final until certified, so book your ticket at your own peril at this point.
Exactly.
Well, and
But probably even just something like, we recognize that the election results are still up in the air, but just something that's just we haven't forgotten about you, right?
Yeah.
Sorry to
Right, right.
interrupt you.
well, and in terms of the mentorship, maybe it's not with a trustee, maybe it's just having a line item where the incoming trustee meets with Cindy to review, to do, to get the badge and do the things that need to happen. So an onboarding, just like you would with a new job.
Yeah, I think that's really important because when Laura and I came on, we were kind of like deer in the headlights, like what now? And we put together her and I, a big Google Doc asking for all this information that we knew to ask for, but then what you don't know that you don't know is the scary part. So it would be really, really helpful for somebody new coming in. And I think it's a great idea I know it adds on to Cindy's plate and that's already full, but I think that would be a great thing for a new trustee to have because it does feel a little bit scary at first when you don't know, you feel like you don't know what you're doing and there's not really anybody there telling you. And that what I found the training that CSBA gave was very helpful, but it's different than boots on the ground, especially when we walked into this. Hopefully it won't be that way for future board members. I pray for them. But that made it, yeah, that was definitely a record, even for me, and I've been in this district 20 years. But yeah, so I think that would be a great addition to and be very helpful.
Just to let you know, when I first stepped into the job in '92, first board meeting, we had to cut $40 million that didn't show up with a bond. Yeah, it was fun. I had a couple of things that I just want to maybe have a little conversation, see if we can get some consensus around. And both of them had been brought up during Shelley's presentation. The first one was the last item under board meeting protocol that dealt with the 10 o'clock end time. The way it's written here, and open for conversation on this, it says that it's the meeting's extended only once, which is a question, but also by majority of the board. And the way that we've handled it has always been a unanimous vote, so that someone, because of a time constraint, cannot continue, and the rest of the board would still continue with a quorum. So I think we need to make a decision because, there's reasons why you wouldn't want to give one person the opportunity to stop the meeting from moving forward, but at the same time, you don't want to keep that person, knock that person out of the potential action of the board by having to leave, and the rest of the board, by majority, it's going to continue. So we've always moved on the unanimous side to continue the meeting.
I would think if someone had a constraint at 11 o'clock at night, like they had to go catch a plane at midnight, the rest of the board would honor that.
I would hope.
But I
so.
also am wondering with the reverse of that, of would we ever be in a position where it was someone trying to control things by voting no and making the unanimous part
And that's,
contentious?
and again, we've had this before, not for our current board, but if we were ever to get into a position where we had a more politically based board member who would play those kind of strategic games.
Right, and that's where I think
That's
the
the
unanimous
concern.
part is maybe more of a concern than the other, because I think most people would honor somebody not being able to stay.
I
But
think,
which is really going to be more likely a real worry.
yeah, since it's our procedure, maybe even done by consensus as opposed to a formal vote. That way there's discussion. Is there a reason why someone can't do it? Because the other side of it is we'd really want to continue the meeting until we finish particularly any specific action items that call for a time limit to them. You don't want to get to the end of the meeting and find that, we've not been able to verify something that needs to be done from a timely perspective too. Just some thoughts. I'm fine either way. I just mention it because of what the practice has
Right.
been, which is unanimous. And I think against our bylaws. The other thing in terms of no meeting going subsequently more than once,
That seems kind of silly.
well, unfortunately, just our last meeting, I asked for a motion to extend out an hour and a half, just based upon what we still had on the agenda. I think that's the first time we've
Yeah,
done something
usually
like
it's in
that.
these
It's
15-minute
15 minutes,
increments.
15, 30 minutes.
Mhm.
So we may want to relook at that aspect as well.
Yeah, and with that section too, it specifically says 10 PM, and maybe we need to put an hour amount instead of a specific time, because there could be meetings that we have like today where it's 1 o'clock, and, is it after 5 hours or 3 hours, we extend, or as opposed to?
Yeah, I know that I've heard this past year, some board meetings, luckily not ours, because I think the latest meeting we've ever had is close to midnight. But there are some that actually went on to like 2, 3
Yeah,
in the
Albany's
morning.
routinely went to like 1.
And I don't see how anyone has the energy to really, really, right? I don't know, cast or make a sound, right, judgment on a vote, or have the energy to really ask questions at that time when, middle of the night. So I think we might want to also look at when we actually end the meeting, or maybe take a vote to like continue next day or something, something else.
This one is addressing regular meetings, so.
Yeah.
Regular.
But I like the idea of, if our meetings generally do start 7 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 3 hours, as a general rule, after 3 hours, maybe you should be asking, are we continuing this meeting?
And do we, with the idea of like a no later than midnight or whatever type of thing, kind of the intent of taking under consideration staff bandwidth, and when we're asking cabinet to stay until 3 o'clock in the morning, I mean, we haven't had that, so, but just kind of looking future at the potential, is there a way to kind of take into consideration with this
There's that, and there's that if it's a public meeting and you're holding it beyond hours that most public can even watch,
Right.
it also
right
gets into how open is your decision making,
right
right?
right
I
You
would
can
just,
hold certain stuff till 2 o'clock in the
Dark
morning
of the
when
night.
nobody's watching, right?
I would just say, though, there could be times when you have to make a decision. And if you have to go until 2 o'clock in the morning, we've seen that in negotiations.
Yes.
So you don't want it to be like that, but there could be instances where, you just have to keep going until you're done. And hopefully it's facilitated in such a way that you're making the optimal use of the time that you have. And if it goes that long, it goes that long, which doesn't preclude us from having the conversation about, should we take a recess and come back tomorrow?
Right. No, it is built in when we're by consensus or by action, we're approving the continuation of the meeting.
And I think maybe we don't need to make a rule that's going to just make things harder. When really what our rules we're talking about is the things we have to discuss next about how do we control maybe some of the earlier things and taking up the majority of the 3 hours that's allotted for the business. And so maybe we don't need to control it with an end time. We control it by controlling the other pieces.
So just for staff, then, is there consensus on the majority? I'm fine with that if everyone feels that's the best way of doing this going forward.
I would just ask, is legally, do we have to take an action to extend the meeting, or can it be just out of consensus?
Sorry.
Well, if you're going to take action to continue the meeting to the next day, if you're at 11 o'clock and people are not watching, but it's a big, important issue, you will have to take action.
Yeah.
So for a clean record, in order to not have any kind of challenges, I will always recommend taking action.
So are we good with majority then?
Good.
And are we good with maybe not requiring it be only one time? Because then it becomes.
Yeah.
We make it 2 hours, or do we make it 15 minutes and do it 3 times? Or-
Right.
Okay. The other one that I had a question was the 8th bullet item under board roles, the one that talks to when a new trustee is elected, they will assume the seat of the trustee that vacated the position. I think our practice, and there's 2 different parts to this. Our practice is, the way it's mentioned
That
here.
was actually not supposed to be there. That's not correct, because if you take last year's election, it would have put the brand new person
Right.
in the presidency
That's-
seat.
that
So,
was the
so
question.
Cindy, something went wrong there.
Yeah, that's the question I had in reading this. Want to make sure that the new member
that
is
first-
basically the 5th trustee.
The first sentence was supposed to be struck out,
Oh,
and then
okay.
it starts with at the organization.
Okay.
I don't know how we ended up with that.
Never mind. No, and the other thing was in terms of, and I know that our bylaws currently say that, like 2 new people coming in seated by alphabetically. Another way of doing it would be highest vote count would be next in line.
Except that now we're trustee areas.
Doesn't matter. It's still highest vote count in your trustee area. Trustee areas are relatively the same size. I know that there is some difference, but that might be a little bit more representative than just alphabetically.
The other argument is you could do it numerically by trustee area.
I think that there's a little bit at stake, right? Because it's 4-year terms and it's 5 trustees. So, for example, for Shelley and I, I'm assuming we were put in order of maybe of last name. Okay. So I have the opportunity to be in my current,
Right.
That's why.
Yeah.
4 years, I have the opportunity to be president, whereas Shelley has to be reelected to be president
Unless-
so,
One last.
right, unless
That's why I
something
think
happens. So.
Trustee area number probably makes more sense so that it's the trustee seat that is moving. Because they're not in the same election, so vote count seems.
Well, it's the same.
Well, but you'd have to look at what order we are in, but you guys are 2 and 3, right? And now you'd be 3 and 2, so yeah, but it only becomes an issue when 2 are coming in and.
Or a shootout of some sort. Well, roll of dice.
But I think comparing
Rock,
2
paper,
different
scissors.
elections is an apple and an orange. And one might have had 3 people in the race and the other had 2, so of course there's more votes there.
That's true
Right.
too. I in fact think of
Yeah.
that part where that could make a difference in how many votes. But it does come down to, yes, the presidency and who's in the current term versus a future term.
That's really the stakes part of it, of which one of you gets to be president in your 4-year cycle. Or
But
things
the
change
other-
a lot, could be both of you do.
But the other part that I believe is strong to hold on to is our history of rotation, 1-year presidency, moving up. It avoids a lot of the issues that we see with other agencies when it comes down to their reorganization and the politics of it. Just try to make it clear beforehand.
Well, it also, right, confirms that we're a body. Each one of us, doesn't matter, new trustee, experienced trustee, which area, whatever, we're all have the same authority, right?
The orderly fashion of it gives an on-ramp too. So, it like, I know as clerk that that I have an on-ramp to being, it's not like I'm all of a sudden president. Oh Lord, here I go, So it allows for that built-in kind of ability
And
to
that was the
learn.
question that I started this with because, for instance, if Rachel, for whatever reason, was not taking the seat, the person who's taking
Yeah,
that
no,
seat,
and that's
all
why
of a sudden would
that
become
was what
president
was
as a
there
brand new
and it was
person.
supposed to be struck. But it does make me wonder if our maps haven't been approved yet. Would it make sense to keep the boundaries the same, of course, but change the numbers so that it actually is an order that stays consistent?
Well, it changes though when someone then gets, again, you just want to avoid a position.
No, but
where
then it
someone-
would actually be that the rotation order goes in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or that would be logical.
Someone that was incoming as president wouldn't, the math doesn't work out, I guess, because they would then move to
Right,
the
you're
end and
right.
then it would be,
Okay,
yeah.
you're right,
Okay,
you're right.
so, I mean,
So just a revolutionary idea. Most districts and cities and counties that have moved to by trustee area, and I'm just looking at the way you are set up, it says Rachel Hurd, board member. It would say trustee area 1, and the plate that would change would be the name of the board member who's coming in. So the trustee areas, so the dais is arranged 1 through 5, and the board president or vice president, that is just added as a plaque at the bottom. So you are representing the geography of your community, and not necessarily being in the center. Again, this is another model that exists out there because this language is pretty old before the by trustee area came into being.
no, I appreciate that. And I think the one reason we sit the way we do is so that the board president is sitting next to the superintendent, not in the middle, so that if there's any dialogue needed in order to move the meeting forward, that's just how we've chosen to do it, as opposed to the president sitting in the middle with board members on either side. Because, yeah, it works different ways for different.
I think it would be a good idea to have the areas underneath our names,
Yeah.
though.
I think, even if
Which
they're
I
not
think
in
we
order.
need to give Helen credit for. She brought that up in one of the meetings.
Well, okay, we'll do that. Great. Other questions of clarification or adjustments to the document? And again, we're not wordsmithing, but really talking about concepts.
There is a spot here where I see, it looks like a heading that was maybe a placeholder, Shelley and Cindy. It said board liaison / board. I think maybe that was just a
Oh.
note we had in our working draft that we need to go back and what did we mean there?
I think we were
Maybe
talking
just-
about the liaison assignments to each board member.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we can cross that out then.
Yeah, along those lines, the other thing was under board agenda, the last item. And again, this is more wordsmithing. It just says member of the public requesting an agenda. It's probably an agenda item or an item on the, to be added to the agenda. just for clarity.
Yeah, and one other kind of more separate idea. What about building in something around how to support an incoming president? So, as it's October, and I know that it's not an election year. I know I'll be president, and it's my first term. What support do I have going into being president? Will there be any kind of training around that? Well, is that something that can be built into this governance handbook, or is that just a general?
In some of the other ones we looked at where there was a recommendation that the vice president actually take the new president's training at CSBA. Isn't that what it was? Rather than waiting until they're just about to be president, doing it basically a year ahead. We could add that back in or add that in.
Yeah, it's just a thought. It just felt like a little bit of a gap, maybe.
If I may just point out to one more thing, under closed session, um, the way it reads currently is that items will be reported out in accordance with the law. I think it should be actions. It's not the item,
Actions.
actions.
Good. Anything else at this time? Good. Again, thank you so much for all the effort and both of you and Cindy for getting us to this point. It's great. Here it is, March, and we said we'd be doing these kind of things in March, and here we are. John, let me turn it back to you for some conversation on the other items.
Yes, thank you, President Mintz. And for the last part of our workshop, one of the things that has come to my attention through different discussions I have with you in the normal work that we do, and I said to Ken that I think it's good to bring to a workshop, is how we can continue to strengthen our meetings in terms of the board's business, which is obviously the priority, the engagement of our community, which has always been a priority, and also ensuring that the environment here at the board meeting is one where all of our community feels that they can be and participate and provide their experience, insight, and voice. And that's a discussion I think that's been happening for quite some time. The other thing that you have been talking about this afternoon is how there are multiple ways that I and we as staff, as well as you as board members, advocate, engage, and connect. And that one of the things that I've learned through some of the staff focus groups I've done most recently is how important our presence is in our community, at our school sites, at various events and such, which is what you've also talked about. So part of what this discussion is, I think, from a superintendent's point of view, is that our board meeting is one exceptionally important place for our public to connect with you and in an indirect way us, and it's not the only time and place. And the reason I share that is obviously in other ways that we are present. We aren't doing the legal business of the board where you make your decisions here, et cetera, but there are ways in which we hear voices, we understand perspectives, and we gain insights. So the part that we wanted to spend here is I've gathered just some of the perspectives I've gleaned from you in appropriate ways over the last little while so that you could have a public conversation about it. And as I said at the beginning of this meeting, if you want to take action, it wouldn't be happening here. We would listen to what you are sharing. We would then look at the bylaws. We would bring something back to you in a board meeting where you could approve whatever it is that you might want to see. So a couple of the things that I'll put on the table are the notion of how we utilize our yellow card process, how that process assists or maybe doesn't assist your work as well as the community's ability to engage. We've talked about previously, and I'm offering it for your conversation again to see if there's different views, where non-agendized public comments should be placed on the agenda. And the reason why that sometimes comes up, at least as members of our community communicate to me, I don't know if they're communicating to you, that it's never clear because we never know how much time will be required, even though I know we have some bylaw language now that would suggest we'd only have a certain portion of time and then we would move to the end of the meeting. I'm just bringing it back here because it's sometimes hard for people to gauge when other agenda items might be discussed, and they may not actually have the time or ability to spend the entire evening with us. So again, there is bylaw language around that, but because it's come up, I'm bringing it to you again. The notion of consent items, how the process of items being pulled off consent, whether it's you who wishes those items to be pulled off consent, or whether it's members of our public who wish items to be pulled off consent, might there need to be some notice? Do you even need or want that? Might there need to be some process around that? That's another piece that has emerged. The notion of how our bylaws communicate a member of the public requesting something to be on the agenda, when it needs to come in, how it needs to come in, and then clarity around what in the role of the president and the superintendent is in relationship to that request. Because what we've had happen is that even though our bylaws do confirm the process, the responsibility, there's also been feedback that that isn't clear to all members of our community as well. And then the last piece that I want to put on the table is just a concept I want to share about the we schedule our board meetings looking to next year. In other words, when they need to be, what rhythm California expects of us regarding certain requirements, such as the LCAP process or the budget process. Sharing with you that sometimes when we have 2 meetings in a row with only a week in between, the impact that might have when it comes to other responsibilities that I've shared, like getting out to our school sites and all the rest. So I want to bring that up at the very end, but I'll stop by saying these are just some of the things that either you have mentioned to me individually, and I said I would bring it here publicly for the appropriate conversation. You may or may not want to speak any further or change anything about it. So how about if we leave the board meeting piece? I'll come back at the end and offer a few thoughts for your consideration. But President Mintz, I think this is just, we know our practices. I think we're all familiar with our bylaws. I think you all have your own personal experiences. You've also heard from members of our community in other ways regarding what they would like to see happen. And I think this is just an opportunity for you to discuss if there's anything that needs to be shifted, changed, adjusted, or left alone in relationship to this topic. And before I turn it back to you, Cindy, you are usually my eyes and ears. Have I missed anything that, okay, because I sometimes do and need a little bit of help. So anyway, I'm going to turn this back to you for conversation. I don't even think, I'll leave it to you to decide how, if you want to talk about it or maybe not. And if so, how you want to talk about it. I think that I'll turn that over to you, President Mintz, to facilitate. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I wrote down, as Dr. Malloy was speaking, 5 different bullet items. And why don't we just, I'll mention each and give us an opportunity to see if we want to have a discussion at this point in time or not. The first one was the utilization of the yellow card process. I'll just open up to anyone have any thoughts.
I have a question about that for our legal eagle over there. In our meetings, the use of yellow cards has been such that the agenda is put out and then everyone has a chance to read what the items are going to be on the agenda. And then they can come to the meeting and put their yellow card in. But what frequently happens is that there'll be an agenda item that the yellow card wasn't put in for, but the minute the person stops speaking, then the yellow cards come at the last minute right after they talked. basically. So then all night, there's this never-ending flow of yellow cards. So what are our obligations as far as making sure that our public is heard? But sometimes it feels like that particular privilege is being overused.
So there is no specific law that says that it has to be presented to the board prior to X time or Y time. It is up to the board to adopt reasonable regulations around how they want to implement usage of this yellow card. So if the board wants to adopt a procedure that says we will not consider any yellow cards until people, once the board starts discussing this item, so it has given to city before the item is discussed, you can do that. But I just want to remind all of us of two things. Whatever rule that we adopt with respect to yellow cards has to be content neutral. It has to be applied uniformly, whether we are talking about the bond or whether we are talking about adopt a dog, whatever. I mean, it has to be a uniform process. The other thing that I want to point out is at the end of the day, you just have to make sure that the public is being heard and it's not being utilized to prevent people from speaking. And so as long as we are reasonably giving people notice, so if the board were to change its practice, you give people notice, maybe a couple of, opportunities of perhaps grace in certain hot button topic areas. But should you want to implement a change, that is completely within the purview of the board as to how efficiently you want to run your board meeting.
Yeah, I've seen a city council meeting, in fact, one of our in a county that will not accept speaker cards after the clerk has announced what the item on the agenda is. So as in our case, the board president reads the item, and at that point, no additional cards can come in. Our last meeting, I chose to put in kind of a quick practice to say that once we opened it up for communication from the public, no additional cards would be able to be pulled in once people started from the public to speak. So you had to have your card in before our public comment period started.
I think if we were to institute something like that permanently, we would have to be saying something like last call for cards on this item.
Right.
I don't like the practice you explained with the
The
city
first one.
clerk part, because I think community should have the opportunity to put in a card in response to what they heard the staff presentation be.
Yeah.
I could see, we get to do our clarifying questions part, then we take public comment. I mean, I can see why you don't want it to go on and on all night with people having their just public comment debates in public. So I can see doing a last call on that. But I wonder if maybe it's more appropriate to consider limiting public comment on any item to no more than 30 minutes. And then if you've got 30 cards, where the president's got 30 cards in their hand, they can say, well, there's 30 of you wishing to speak to item 10.2. How about if we limit everybody to 1 minute? So that, I mean, now granted, they've got the 3 minute, just there's different ways to get to where we want to go. But I think we need to be careful that in our reactions to what we're not liking about right now, we're not becoming unwelcome.
And I am not suggesting
And I wasn't
that city
accusing you of
council,
becoming
yeah,
unwelcome.
no, and I'm not suggesting that city council's approach, because I found as a person in the audience, not knowing what they're going to say, I don't know
You don't know if you have anything.
if I
to say.
had anything to say. And in that case, representing an organization too is very important that I have so I'd put in a card, and this is the problem with that approach.
Put in a
You
card.
put in
every
a
time.
card just in case, so that you might not need. As far as the time limit, I just have an issue with that one simply because personally I see that as limiting public input. I want anyone who wants to speak on a subject to speak. However, I think we can shore up our process in terms of the collection of cards and responsibility of the public to know, okay, this is a business meeting. If you want to speak during the meeting, we want you to have that opportunity. However, you have to follow the rules
Right.
of getting the card in when we tell you have to. I know we turned back at least one card at that last meeting. Someone tried turning in a card.
I was just
during the
trying to
public
get
comment.
responsive to what John was saying about people who are watching or attending the meeting being able to gauge when they need to show up. And the most recent meeting, it was not an agendaized public comment because we had agendaized that item. And so, you know, you can have agendaized public comment that goes on for 2 hours if you don't have some way of limiting it.
Absolutely.
I did have another question though, and this would go to the legal team. Are there specific agenda items that we can say we don't take comment on? For example, association president's reports or student, I mean, are there any things that, any items there that we can say we won't take public comment on?
So generally, in my experience, and I know San Ramon constructs their agenda in a different way. Generally speaking, those information reports come at the very end, and it's an opportunity for your constituent groups to talk to you. And in my experience, there is no public comment, but when COVID is happening and parents do want to address teachers unions and classified unions, many boards have allowed a limited amount of public comment on information items. There is, again, no legal requirement that it can happen or it cannot happen. It is completely within the purview of the board as to how you want to run a meeting. And it's all about parent engagement or community engagement and community voice.
And if I can just add a practical comment, what I'm trying to help our team do, even more than before, even though I think they did great work before, is ensuring that the majority of information that will be heard is a part of the package. I know that there are times when there's a time constraint and that you see the presentation the same time the community does, because that's also a Brown Act requirement. But that if we can get all information into the package, including, the report, the presentation, and so forth, that allows our community to read and understand what's happening. I think that when a presentation is finished, if there's a period where cards are collected, even for a moment, it also stops something that's very awkward, which is I could be in the middle of a presentation and I'm handing a yellow card down. Or Ken, you're trying to listen to the person who's in the last presentation, and I'm handing you 2 more cards that you're trying to figure out, is it for this item or if it is for another item. So the one housekeeping piece, which has nothing to do with engagement or voice, it just has to do with operationalizing something, is when you say, the presentation is now over, hopefully the majority of that presentation would have already been shared in written fashion. The purpose of the comment is to address the board that anyone wishes to speak, we take those voices, we're ready, and then you know that you've got 20 or 30 or 2. The trouble is you might start with 4. And before that topic is over, there might be another 6. But it's not in response necessarily to the board, the staff report to the board. It may actually be in direct response to someone else who spoke. So the question for legal team's advice would be, where we're hearing from some of our community that they're uncomfortable with that aspect of things, where the actual response is to another member of the community, not to you. That is something that I guess would be legal, but I'm also offering for your consideration that is there a way not to silence voice, to support engagement, but to keep the focus on the community addressing you. Obviously, they are addressing everybody, but that's, as I understand it, the purpose for why someone is putting in the card, requesting to speak, and wanting your consideration of something. And before I ask, did I get that right? Okay.
See, that's why I like the idea as a facilitator to be able to have a cutoff in terms of, giving people the opportunity to know this is the approach, that after this point, we're not going to be accepting any more cards. And it gets back to what John was saying. That's what happened at that last meeting. We had 20 cards, and I think it was under 20 cards. And my thinking going in was, if I had 20 cards or more, I would limit it to 2 minutes, for instance. Well, again, if it's on an
Went over the
ongoing,
threshold
you
after
have
you
no
got
idea. At least that way you have that set amount and you're able to establish a time frame.
If I may just add one thing, your current board policy states the board shall limit the total amount of time for public input on each item to 20 minutes. So you already have that
Yeah,
built in.
we've never,
I didn't even know that was in
never
there.
met that. That's probably something that needs to be adjusted. Because we've always really focused our meetings on full information from staff as well as the public. And I think we want to continue that, but that's where we start hitting up against the time frame.
Just as an aside, because not all board members have heard me say this, and I want to say it in public, because we've adopted policies that we are grateful to CSBA for their help a few years back. We're going through the process of ensuring that even though some of those policies may not align with our practices, that we actually figure out how to get those policies to align with our practices so that we don't have this discrepancy, because there are places where we're seeing that discrepancy, and all that does is confuses things, because someone else could call and say, but you have this in your policy, why am I waiting till 9:30 for that agenda item? But to your point, well, that's never been our practice, because we want to engage the community, which means it's our job to be sure that our policy, I'm only pointing back as Cindy's helping me with this section, is aligned with our practice. So I just wanted to put.
And in fact, a number of years ago, we had gone through and redid our entire policy manual based upon CSBA. And in so doing, hundreds of pages, we probably, I know a staff put a lot of time and energy in, and the board took a lot of time.
Missed that one for 20 minutes.
Next, there's one more statement that allows. It says, with board consent, the president may increase or decrease the time allowed for public presentation depending on the topic and the number of persons wishing to be heard. So it does have that
We
next
do that
sentence.
for every topic.
Yeah, you have been. I just wanted, it was important for you to know that you have board policy that allows you to hold to 20 minutes.
I have a few thoughts. So just based on this conversation. So I do think that there is a difference between a non-agendized comment section and a action item comment time, and that allowing, having a cap on non-agenda time and then moving that to the end of the meeting is one thing. But I think when we're taking action on something, really being able to allow those that are prepared and have come in and put in a yellow card to be able to speak to that comment, whether it's reduced down to 1 minute or consolidated in groupings, but not limiting that to, only 30 minutes type of a thing. I think that there's a difference between the two. And then I would like for us, as we're talking about public comment, to also include our email option. So perhaps there's a way, and I don't know if this is even correct from a legal standpoint, but perhaps there's a way to have passing a yellow card be stopped, whether it's when the presentation begins, when the presentation ends, when it's open for public comment after we've had our opportunity to ask questions. And I think there's arguments for all three of those that we can discuss. And then ensuring that the public realizes that they still have an opportunity through email public comment to make a public comment during the time of the public comment that's happening in person, and the conversation that we're having before we make the vote, and that will still be in the minutes, so that there is that opportunity for public voice. But it's in the scope of no. Us being able to see them, right. But it's
Because that makes me question the role of it. Because if it's that, it's that they're getting to communicate to the public what they want to say. It has no way of influencing us, because we're not supposed to be looking at the email during the meeting. So I would almost think that we need to push back on that, because unless we're fine with being a sitting board as a place to publish people's public comments, but the point of public comment is to influence our vote, not as a way to be able to Google yourself and.
yeah, but I mean, I think it's this is just philosophically for me, I think that another reason for public comment is to get your comment on the record so that your voice is a part of the record as a, I mean, yes, it's important to, we listen and we hear what's being said and, to that point of when we can, timing wise, and that affects how we have the conversation and make the decisions. But there's also that aspect of, I want to make sure that people know that I stand behind gender neutral bathrooms or whatever it is, right? So it's that.
'Cause I know when you do public comment for like a state level meeting, it's public comments come in by, 5 o'clock on a given day before the meeting, because the intent is that you're influencing decision making.
The other thing about that legislative hearings, particularly at the committee level, you always just have, your key opponent and proponent give a presentation. Everyone else who shows up is only able to say who they are, what organization they're from, and whether they support or oppose. And even the support and oppose are handled as two separate lines. So everyone who wants to support a particular action gets in line and says they support it, and that's the only thing they're allowed to say. And then opponents, the same type of thing. Maybe closing remarks by the main opponent and proponent. I'm not suggesting that here. However, at the same time, we've on occasion, number of occasions, have asked people, if you're just going to be repeating what someone else has already said, it is okay to get up and say you agree with the previous speaker. You don't have to use 3 minutes time to make your individual point. I'm not
We
sure
haven't
that's
had too
really
many
worked.
takers on that.
No, not too, not too many. The one other thing, though, that I think we need to address at some point, maybe not right now, and that is as we have moved into more of a hybrid approach for our audience, how we handle people online. And whether we do at some point in time provide, as we did initially during the lockdown, an opportunity for people to give live comment from an online perspective. I believe that that's an option these days going forward. I don't think that was just part of an emergency order.
You're right. It still remains as an option. But I think the problem that happens is you want public are commenting so that you can take their comments into consideration as you decide how you are going to take action. And unless you are live streaming the actual feed in real time, you're listening to the public and reading the comments at the same time. So there is an investment of technology and investment of infrastructure to do that really well. But I do want to sort of go back to the point that we were earlier talking about, which is if you want members' emails to be considered as part of your vote, the cutoff time is the right way to go because that sort of gives everybody the same data to operate from. If they are live tweeting it in real time or live commenting it in real time, there is no guarantee that as you are sitting in this forum considering an action item, that you've taken their input into account.
Let me clarify. What I was talking about was having people online being able to basically put in a speaker card. And we've done that. And there's pros and cons. And we've had the capability of doing that part.
We basically just stopped it when we went back.
Right.
Correct. As soon as we went back and started having meetings in person, we've only taken live comment from the audience present. But that, again, is something we may want to consider if we want to do something like that and what that would, the process we would use for doing it to make sure that we're.
And Laura, I want to emphasize that you're referring to, the example of someone having
Well, yeah, and I think that it makes sense to have a deadline for public comment emailed so that we can read it before, making having our conversation and making our decision. But then I go into how is that, where's the, where's the equity in that versus, someone having the opportunity to put in a yellow card um, at the end of our questioning, let's say, or the presentation, and then be able to give that public comment when we're cutting off email public comment at 4. It just complicates things, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's, and then you add in the the fact that just the reality of the fact that there are people in our community that are not comfortable standing up at a podium and speaking their truth because it doesn't necessarily align with the truth of others in the room, and they just don't feel safe doing that. So how do we, kind of make public comment free, accessible, right, 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 right.
Yeah. And if I can just add one piece from the beginning, and you all spent time talking about it. The board meeting is a very important place for the community to be, offer their voice and experience and influence thinking, or to place something on the public record. And obviously that's very important. Because of how I'll certainly speak for myself, and then since you're copied on many of the things that I'm sent, or sometimes I'm copied on what you're sent, there are all kinds of other ways that our community chooses to engage you and us. And we're very explicit about trying to be as responsive as we possibly can in this district. So that's another way that we offer the important voice engagement participation that I'm grateful we do. I'm glad to be here and be part of it, and I hope that it continues. And we need to be sure that the board's business is dealt with in a way that's effective and helpful, because these sometimes are very big decisions, and that has to be on the table as well. So it's an and, it's not an or. And I just want to frame it that way again, so that nobody who is listening to us might think that it's an either or, because it's not. It's an and. The community, voice, engagement, and board business and decision making, and how to do that effectively is what we're simply, trying to see if there's any strategies. These are all some great ideas. I'm not hearing any directions yet for us to take back, which is fine. But I'm just letting you know that before this section ends, if you want us to look at any of the bylaws in particular and want us to do any work with them, I'm going to be asking for, that real clear direction before we end.
And I wonder if there's a role for if we are going to be reducing the number of board meetings that we have, which I thought was the second part of what we were going to address. Does that create even more need to create enough time in the board meeting to get through all the business if we're meeting less often?
And I think that's one of the issues that are going to come up with scheduling the board meetings is if you have fewer board meetings, are they longer? Or do they cut down on the amount of time the public has to engage us? So I think that's one of the things we'll have to discuss. As far as this item, I guess in terms of a path forward, I brought it up, and after listening to others, I would like us to look at what it would take and the pros and cons of accepting public comment online, live, in addition to speaker here in the room, given what you were saying in terms of folks who, for whatever reason, aren't attending our meetings in person. It would be something that maybe comes out of the learnings that we've had of being in lockdown. But I think there are both pros and cons, and I'd really like the board to have an opportunity to really consider both sides of
Right,
it
and
making a decision.
Yeah, and I think that we actually had someone who came a couple times in person. I think once online, once in person, who actually requested
Yeah,
us
one
to look
was-
into
one
that.
was a student center.
Yes, exactly.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that would be good.
I don't think there's any more information to be brought. I think you just need to decide what you'd like. We know how to do it. We've experienced it before. I'm not sure, President Mintz, what we would be able to share with you, except you actually have experienced that. It's technologically possible. It's legally allowed. It does add a dimension to engagement, and it potentially, adds time. The only insight I've gained from districts who continue to do this work that way, and I think our F3 colleagues shared this with me before, part of what they're experiencing is whose voices are they listening to? Their community, or even in some cases from other states, depending upon the issue. So I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I should ask the question if you don't mind. Is the board legally allowed to ask where somebody lives and who, are they our community or are they from the other side of the states?
So the board is not legally
That's what I thought.
allowed to ask that question, and it does result in people coming on based upon the topic that is being addressed, who do not live in this community, and oftentimes they drown the voices of the people who live in the community. So that is one of the big challenges of
And that happens here in the boardroom as
Right.
well as.
Right.
But it's a lot easier to call in than
Yes.
it is to get in your car and come down here. And I totally appreciate the intent of bringing back the voice for the folks who do not feel comfortable being in the room. But I do think if we were to go down this path, we would seriously have to come up with some time limits, or we could spend all night
Yeah.
on one item.
Well, and I would offer that maybe there's other ways to do it, right? Thinking a little bit outside the box. Like one of the thoughts that I had as we're having this conversation, and specifically when I think about that email and that cutoff with email, is making sure that, you know, we put the agenda out, making sure that we can, when possible, at least have an outline of what the presentation is going to be, have detail in that agenda that helps the public to see what it's about, as best as I know that's more of a load on staff, but as best as we can, and then also amplifying the agenda out, so it's not just put on the website and then that's it. It's the agenda is out, here it is, you know, pushing it out on social, through email, whatever, with the communication plan, so that our community has the opportunity to respond to that agenda in a timely manner, so that then if they choose to respond via email with their public comment, they can do that. If they choose to come to the boardroom, they have enough time to be able to think about what they want to put on that yellow card, so that they can in fact turn it in on time, so that we don't have that, you know, post question kind of time. So just looking at it in that way, and spreading out the opportunity rather than creating specific opportunity that will then also create more inequity, really.
Just one thought in terms of online participation, just like a cutoff for people in the room with yellow cards. You know, we could state that you have to have your hand raised online at a certain point in that agenda item to be heard in that agenda item, and we would take them in order. And I think we did something similar before. One question for our attorney, similar to what Dr. Malloy asked, but a little different. My understanding, and you can help correct me on this, we can't ask people who come to a meeting to give us their names and addresses. However, do we have to accept people to be able to speak anonymously to the board, to actually speak? Can you please answer that for me?
So there is, in the Brown Act, there is no language that says that people have to state their identity or even the right identity. So generally speaking, people have their names up. There is no way to certify whether the name is authentic or real. But if somebody is not posting their name or identity, and I'm not saying that it has to be matched to their driver's license, maybe that is a way to exclude, simply because there is no way we can verify whether or not they're an adult or a child or whatever on this particular forum. But generally speaking, there is no reason for a board to not take public comments from anyone who is online, who's presenting with a name, with their camera on, and speaking to the board, because that would be viewed as, content discriminating against people based upon the content of their comment or not showing their face.
So if someone starts making threatening comments online or even in person,
That's a
how-
different,
well, but you don't know until after they've started that that's going to happen.
right. And that is when you can say that the meeting is being disrupted and you can cut off the access or ask them to leave because it becomes a disruptive standard. But you can't limit people from coming on and speaking because I think when people don't have their names, boards generally say, please identify yourself. And the person will say, I'm Susan or I'm Joe and move on. And there is I would advise the board not to get stuck on the mechanics of whether or not people are actually presenting identity online or in person. I just think it gets us to a different place, which is more litigious than
I
it
know
needs
for
to be.
so many years, though, you go to a city council and, well, even on our card, we ask for a name, address, school that you're associated with. It's all optional.
Yes, yes. I mean, we circled it, circled it with a question mark. But that is not you will not be limiting people's comments based upon what information they provide you or not. There is no requirement that the persons who are addressing the board live in your community. And so at the end of the day, you just want to make sure that you're maximizing opportunities for your community to address you rather than people.
And I think that's why the information's asked for in the first
I
place.
agree.
If someone
And
makes a comment and we know who to get back to, we can handle a particular situation that's been raised.
yes.
As opposed to, it's just a comment.
Well, but I guess the question is, if a person refuses to give their information, are you not going to listen to the comment? And my advice would be, no, you listen to the comment because I think cutting people's comments off without because they are not providing that information, I think it gets us into a much more murkier area.
Yeah, but it's also down to hearing versus listening to a
True.
person's comment. They
And
choose
you,
to be
you do
anonymous.
wonder if they don't give you anything there, how do you tell them it's their turn?
Well, if I may, we learned how to do that because someone goes into the queue. I think if I could just double back to what I shared earlier, when I leaned for the legal opinion, because I think I knew the answer, but I needed to be sure I did, which is you can't demand some of those things. To finish off the question you asked, there isn't really much we can offer you from a staff perspective related to the online piece because you've experienced it already. The technology is not the problem. Even people not identifying yourself, if you can remember, Greg or Logan would say, okay, next in line, could you identify yourself? And if they didn't choose to, they just come on with their voice because it's how it works. But when I was thinking about if there's any additional information I can offer you, the only additional information I've gleaned through my networks is that because you aren't allowed to ask certain information or demand it, and because of the fact that you wouldn't limit someone's voice over another, that's the only vulnerability that I've heard related to the online approach. That could potentially limit our own community's voice in this space. And then to what Laura's saying, there are probably other strategies we can use that we're already employing. One, I've already shared, we're trying to ensure the package does include everything. Two, that the language in the reports, you may be following this, are modernized. In other words, there is California compliance language that unless you've been around the board table or in the board meetings a lot, I certainly didn't understand it when I got here 2 years ago. And we're trying to ensure that if we use any of that compliance language, that there's another 2 sentences that explain what it means. 3, there are probably some strategies that we can learn best practice regarding agenda themselves, because we have a certain standard of how we do things that probably something we can improve. So I'm working on that with Cindy with help of others to say, how can we do this in a user-friendly fashion, and then ensure that there are no agenda items that nobody can understand because of what it says there, and then how can we blast it out through Newsflash or something to at least allow our community to know, if you're interested, here's the link. some of those kinds of things we
So
can
it
do
goes
as
to
well.
everyone rather
Yeah.
than being on a special list.
Yeah,
Right.
and I'm sorry, I keep interrupting. And just to add on, also educating the community about how to give public comment. So I just want to add that to it as well.
I just wanted to share that. I observed that you want to hear the public voice and you want to hear it at the right time before you make a decision. I think the engagement plan that you discussed earlier is an important opportunity for you to clarify that to people and to clarify the rhythm of your work. Rarely, if ever, does an item come to you on an agenda and that night you make a decision. It's studied in committee, it's brought to you as an information. You can go out and explain that to the public and help them understand where to add their voice in the most meaningful way. As to your meetings where you take public comment, I watched the other night people sitting and raising their hand when you were discussing and deliberating. They really don't necessarily understand the rhythm of your work and the constraints. So I would just say your efforts to use in very friendly, consumer-friendly language, clarification around when voice can be added, why you're closing speaker comments, not to shut down the voice, but after we hear board reports, we will shut down comments, so this would be the time to help bring them along, because really, unless you're a board member junkie, it's really very confusing and people are adding their voices. School is very emotional right now after COVID. So I just wanted to offer, from sitting back there and thinking, there were people who were just genuinely confused. And I know that you are so earnest in wanting to hear the public voice. I just wanted to share that with you, having sat at the back of the room.
Oh, thank you.
The back of the bus commentary. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Again, another legal type question, and I think I know the answer, but do we have any liability by not accepting online speakers? Is there anything that's, a sense that we're cutting out public comment?
May I ask a clarifying question? So what you're asking is, if you did not have an online component to your board meetings and having public comment, is there liability attached to that? No, the forum is open. You just have one forum, which is the board meeting in person. Many districts, that's the only forum. It's not, COVID was an unusual time where we got used to the hybrid meetings, but boards that have gone back to the original pre-COVID in-person meeting and processes. So you won't be alone.
Okay, just wondering if things revolving in a certain way around Brown Act and public comment.
No, not with this lens.
Okay. Anything else on, well, we've covered several of these back and forth. Shelley?
I just had one comment, and that is that my concern is that our meetings are to conduct our board business. And I know this has been a really volatile time and maybe not the best example, but I'm not interested in stifling public comment or public voice. I want to hear from my community. It's very important to me, and I take it seriously when I make my decisions. My concern is that I feel like, as a board member, that I struggle with getting our business done and being able to focus and pay attention when it's midnight, because we've had many midnight meetings. And if there are things that we can do to make our process more efficient in our meetings and put some things in place, some boundaries in place that are appropriate, that's what I would like us to focus on. Because at the end of the day, I want to know that, number one, that I'm making good decisions based on the fact that I'm alert and able to stay conscious during the whole process and stay focused, and that I'm hearing appropriately from our public. It's just felt like we're a little bit out of balance. And if there's a way to make that better, I really want to look at that. I think sometimes, I know we're very sensitive about making sure that everybody's heard, and I am too, but I think the pendulum swung a little too far one way, and we need to rein it in just a little bit for the sake of making good, solid decisions as a governing body.
So we were talking about utilizing yellow cards. We've also touched upon, well, we haven't gotten consent items, but first, non-agendized placement. There's a suggestion in the reports of doing first 30 minutes and then not cutting out the rest of the non-agenda items, but having that at the end with other reports. Do we have some consensus of trying that approach at the very least?
Well, we've put that in place, but we haven't needed it because
Okay.
non-agendized public
right.
comment hasn't gone more than 30 minutes since we put that into
that's
place.
true.
So
Yeah.
I'm not really thinking that we need
We're
to
already there.
undo that
Okay.
unless what we are being asked to consider is to move non-agenda items comments, I mean, all the way to the very end. And I understand the desire to do that, but that makes me uncomfortable because I think if we can get out of our COVID world and look back on the previous world, those comments are usually an item here, an item there. A lot of times they're just friendly little PSAs, you know, come to this event or just wanted to share some good news about this. And I don't think we're gonna get people coming to do those kind of things at 10:30. So I guess I would like to leave it at the beginning and like test our process. We haven't even needed to use it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I agree. Like we haven't needed that, so let's at least test,
Yeah, that's
make
what I
sure.
thought. We hadn't even done it yet.
Yeah.
We haven't used it. But okay, so 30
agree.
minutes though works.
I
for everyone?
agree.
Continue that
And
way?
one of the things I think we need to do is Cindy's reminding me that we have kind of our public comment process written out that is sent, but it actually has not, even though it's public and it's always been sent, it's not yet been incorporated into our actual bylaws. So that I think is something, if you're okay with it, that I believe we should do, so that there's one place for everything that governs your meetings, including this strategy.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. In fact, the only reason I'd even consider moving all of the non-agendized is actually a heavy-handed approach to treating our public like kids. That unfortunately, people make their comments and they leave. Just before we get to discussing our budget, discussing key important issues in running the district, I'd almost like to have them have to stay if they want to participate and listen to those things, but I know that's not going to happen. I'm not suggesting that. But I think that doing the 30 minutes and then testing that, we'll see how that goes. And also prioritizing the comments. So if there are one-off type of cards as opposed to a group of folks that we know want to speak on the topic, we'll give them the opportunity, but recognizing they may fall.
They don't take up the whole 30 minutes.
Right. Okay. Consent items. The issue on consent items is these, as we all know, are items that are considered that are considered routine in nature. They're all being, I believe, better handled in terms of staff reporting as part of our agenda packet. And one suggestion that I heard from another agency just the other day was that when we ask people if they want to remove something have something removed from the consent calendar, instead of getting 3 minutes initially, they're given an opportunity to very quickly in a sentence clarify why they would want something removed from the consent calendar. And it's then up to the board to decide whether it remains on the consent calendar or not. Because many times it may just be a question for staff or a quick comment, as opposed to needing a full presentation and comments on all sides. That seems to work for one organization. I don't know if there's anything legally that would keep us from doing something like that.
No, it's actually quite a common practice in school boards as well.
So when we hit consent calendar items, we clarified that board can take something off immediately. The public can ask to have something removed, but we would ask them, why do you want it removed?
You would ask for a rationale, and then the board makes a decision whether or not it needs to be removed by a motion.
By motion.
Yes.
So
So
we're
would the
basically
person
voting,
come to the mic?
so we're voting on the request.
Yes,
And if the request is denied, basically it stays on the consent.
That's
calendar
correct.
And treated as one of the most.
that's correct.
Okay, and that is done in other organizations?
Yes,
Yeah.
frequently.
Okay.
Well, I just
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
So if it's that the someone in the public has a question about the agenda item, is that the opportunity that they ask the question, or is it just they're making a statement for the request? And then that if we approve, then they ask the question when it becomes a
No,
non-consent.
so procedurally, a member of the public would say that they have a concern about the consent item. The board president who's running the meeting will ask what the concern is, and if they want to take it off the consent the consent agenda, the board president would say, okay, we need to know what your reasoning is, and then the board will vote whether or not to move it off the
And
consent.
that's not a
agenda.
3-minute type of, that's a quick 1-line type of, this is my concern. The other thing that I've heard other agencies do is on consent calendar items specifically, there's a requirement that someone would have to notify someone on staff to get clarity on that item. And it would be staff that would let the board know that it's being removed from a question from the public. So the public would actually have to review the agenda beforehand, know that they have a question on something on consent, get their clarification so that they're not taking up the board's time on something that is routine in nature.
So if we were to do such a thing, for the member of the public would send an email to Cindy and John's office, and then,
Asking for something to remove for consent, basically the same way, but do it prior to the meeting. And the staff would let
and
us know.
conceivably, they could just get their question answered right then.
Exactly. Or staff could then, when we're voting on the agenda, could ask that something be immediately moved to the action item because we've gotten that request.
If I may, President Mintz,
Yeah,
I don't think I
just-
want to put staff or me in the position of deciding that. I really think that's your job to decide. We get questions from the public all the time. We try to answer those questions as quickly as we can. And if they are questions where the information already exists and it's not a record that we have to wait, we would answer that anyway. So I have no trouble with somebody calling Cindy or the appropriate department and saying, I don't understand what this means. And we would, my worry about making decisions for you is that then why would we say yes and why would we say no? And I don't believe that, I think that could put us in a position that's not appropriate.
I think the one part of, and I agree, I think the one part of that is if really someone is looking for clarification, how much of the board meeting time needs to be taken up. Again, other organizations I've seen, I mentioned this to John earlier, one particular city council never even gets out of their consent calendar items during their meeting because their meeting goes so long that they have to have a second meeting like the next day just to finish their consent calendar items for the number of things they're pulled off that should be considered routine. Now that's a more politically charged environment for sure. And I hope we would never get anywhere near that. But I think it starts with agenda planning and making sure that, those items that fall on consent truly are, single routine items that have received enough information that for most people, they should be able to look at it and feel that there's enough information to recognize that it's a routine item. But just, it takes our time to do legally. We have to make a decision, we have to move on and give us more time to those things that take more decision time. So again, these things I raised just from what I'm hearing about how others have handled it. I'm not suggesting necessarily that we would do that, but maybe there's something about those that we may want to take into.
Well, I think that having just stepped off the presidency for the last year, I think more than the yellow cards, um, pulling consent items off and trying to manage, right, the new agenda now, um, uh, takes more time, actually. And then a lot of times the consent items that are pulled are really just like clarification to, from the staff and things like that. So um, I think if we do kind of maybe consider another way of doing, because now actually I've got to say to the staff that you guys have made the agenda, overall agenda, consent, everything. I mean, all the information, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of information of what we are looking at is in the packet. So, you know, I think that it might be good to kind of take a look, maybe that first option, to kind of ask why. And if it's really a question, we can kind of quickly direct them to staff, right? And not really have board time. Because again, I think that um, more time is spent really going through the consent agenda items that are pulled.
And my only concern would be, because this is kind of loose, state your concern, might we end up taking more than 3 minutes anyway? That's my only worry. I mean, we have to try it and see how it works.
Well,
But do you wanna say something?
oh, go ahead, Joan.
I think it would be a good idea to try it. Because I think, as has been said, if it's legitimately a question of clarification, we could take care of it right away. Worst case scenario, it might take 3 minutes, but would have taken 3 minutes if we did it the other way. So,
Well, 3 minutes plus staff presentation, which, given changes to how our agenda packet's put together, a lot of times it's a repeat of what's in the agenda
Yeah.
package in the first place. So,
So maybe we
So
could try that before
consensus to try that?
before we like put it in a bylaw, we could just try it? Does that work? Or do we need to put it in a bylaw and then, okay,
I would tell you to put it in a bylaw and maybe put a expiration time on it, and the board can mutually then agree to put it in perpetuity. Yeah.
And President Mintz, if I can also add quickly, it's that same balance. So when our community reaches out for questions, we answer as quickly as we can. But I'm just also putting a caution out that sometimes what's being asked may be either more political in nature, or it may actually not be a simple question of clarification. And sometimes our team is invited to engage in that process. The reason I'm being clear in this forum is because what we've done there is to say where information exists and can be answered quickly, we always do it. Where something is not that difficult to find, we always send it. But when a record of what's being asked does not exist, we don't necessarily create it, because you direct our work, and some of what is sometimes asked would take considerable staff time to compile. So I just want you all to know, I know I've shared this with you before, but I'm sharing it with again, that we try to use that framework so that we are as hospitable as we can, but not to a point where we actually can't manage it. And unfortunately, there have been times, and maybe it's just the last while, where it's just been more than we could actually facilitate. So I just want to be sure you were all okay with that. And if not, let me know. But that's been the process we've been following. So.
I mean, and honestly, it seems like the consent items that are pulled tend to be common contracts over 50,000, right? The big long list of all the warrants and the book adoptions. And it just makes me wonder, is there something that we could add to the staff report that could maybe clarify some of that? Or in some cases, is it really just, this is an opportunity where I want to get up and say my piece about that particular book, for example? So
The one thing I can say
some are
about
repairable, some might not be.
the one thing I can say about contracts over 50,000 is I've asked the team to be absolutely clear that there's knowledge of what it is. And we can't always guess what a question might be, but that there's a level of detail that allows that. The textbook adoption, since I've been here, the team goes to pretty significant lengths to explain. So I think I see, though you're right, those are the two that we see the most. I think that the work we're doing on the one is ongoing so that it's clear, because some of those things are just not clear unless you work in insurance or unless you work in facilities or what have you. But the textbook one, I'm not sure how we would make that one clearer from my own
So
perspective.
that one might actually, trying this new method might actually help. I want it pulled because I'm opposed to this book, and then we would be deciding whether we're gonna pull it or not, and it really could speed things up.
And also it provides the opportunity for someone to clarify, and yes, we pull the item.
Yeah.
And we give it a fuller conversation.
right,
That-
right.
That can happen as well. Happened during agenda setting this morning. So, okay, moving on, public agenda item requests.
I may, this one may not take much time. I think our bylaw is exceptionally clear. I don't know if everyone in our community understands this particular bylaw, which is why I know it's crossed my desk, it's crossed yours, and I wanted to raise it. That, of course, any board member or member, forgive me for just a moment, because I'm going to read right from it. Any board member or member of the public may request that a matter within the jurisdiction of the board may be placed on an agenda at a regular meeting. It must be submitted in writing to the superintendent's office or designee no later than 4:30 Monday of the week before, because that fits into our agenda planning. The part that I think might not be fully understood is the next paragraph, which is the board president and the superintendent make the decision. And that probably the place where I've seen this the most challenged or stressful is somebody believes that it is within our jurisdiction, and myself and the president may not believe it's within our jurisdiction. And of course, we're always very clear about communicating any decision in response. And I raise it here because that piece is sometimes missed in the work I've done with our community when the request has happened, that there is another step. And so I just wanted to, because it's come up, you've had some questions about it. It's already explicitly here. I'm not suggesting it needs to be changed, but I just wondered if that still remains your position and what you believe is healthy and good, so that we continue to follow it, or if you wanted any adjustments, obviously that becomes your discussion that we would take away.
I think that with this, and really a common thread through all of these pieces, is really making sure that the community understands how each of these pieces work. So, I just put that out there as something that to really kind of think about from a communication standpoint, and make sure that there's opportunities, and a variety of opportunities for the community to be educated on how to put an agenda item in, how to do a yellow card, how consent items work, all of those things. And so anyway, so just from a communication standpoint, think about how, maybe it's things like this conversation that we're having, but it's also, maybe through PTA, through, educational webinars on how these things work, right? They're, just educating the community about that, I think is important.
And probably as I'm listening to you, and we can take this back, there are probably ways right within the board meeting itself when, something has emerged, that we actually can do a little bit of education explaining what the bylaw says, what the process means, where the practice comes from, how the law supports it or requires it, et cetera. That sometimes helps too, because the people who are most connected to it might be here. And that becomes the option for you to consider too.
The one part of that I have a question about is the first part where it says that the item has to be in writing by 4:30 the Monday prior to. That kind of makes an assumption that it could be on the next agenda. And in many cases, when someone's asking for something, it's going to take staff time. It's going to take research or clarification, getting back to someone, having a meeting in addition to just agenda planning for that next week's meeting. And so I'm just afraid that when we put a timing on that, it makes it sound like, well, it's going to happen, as opposed to you can submit it any time, and we'll get back to you within a certain time frame to give you some sense of what's happening with it. However, to be that specific, I'll stop there.
Yeah, to your point, President Mintz, there's nothing in the rest of it which would suggest what you just said, and that sentence would suggest, well, I've got to get it in on, by that time so that they can consider it for that next meeting.
Creates an
Yeah.
expectation.
Okay, we
Yeah.
can take that back.
Okay.
I wonder though, to add on to what Laura was saying about the overall process, is should there be, and maybe it's not in the bylaw, maybe it's in the communication plan, conveying the idea that you've been talking about quite a bit, John, about how you've got a calendar for the whole year of what comes where, and to be conveying that that is a system. And that also puts into perspective realistic expectations about how quickly something could come. I mean, I think a lot of times people don't realize how much effort and planning and research and collaborating and committee work has happened before something comes to us to vote on. To just bring a concern to us and expect us to be acting on it that night. Now, someone might bring a concern to us that they want to bring for attention, but board meetings aren't the only avenue for doing that. If we're engaging the community, they can be concerned about anything and bring that forward. So maybe that kind of ties to the communication plan that we bring to.
To Laura's point about educating the community, that's something that was on my radar when I ran, and that is that there is huge misconceptions in this community about what a board does, how it works, what our role is, what the role of the superintendent is, the executive cabinet. And I think as part of the communication plan, it would be helpful if we had not big, long, paragraphs about how government works or how we govern, but, like just short little spots that go out that say, do you know how to put an agenda item on a school board? What are the function of school board members? What do they do? How do they govern? What does the superintendent do? These are all things that if they were put out in short little spurts like that people might actually pick up and pay attention to. Because I think even as sophisticated as most of the people are in this community, there's not really a lot of understanding about who's responsible for what, and how we all work together, and what our constraints are also. Like, did you know in the Brown Act, board members can't be in the same place discussing anything to do with school board matters? Well, maybe that seems obvious to a lot of people, but it's not obvious to everybody. So I think that's really an important piece to the communication that we're going to have with the community.
Yeah, and I think that, we, with technology today, we have that opportunity with social media just to do simple little slide things, how to put in for agenda item, and then, we're an educational institution, right? So leveraging what we know about how to educate and do that for the community and the students.
And how to put in an agenda item would be like the last of 20 slides, because really the issue is how do you bring the concern forward, right? I mean, that's the real issue. And that's part of the education process.
In
right?
fact,
Who
that's what
to?
hit me is, in a lot of cases, what we're talking about is like grievance issues, and our work in trying to bring the grievance down to the lowest possible level in the organization to get it resolved, not come to the board with your grievance. You can do it, but if you really want to get something done, have you spoken to your teacher? Have you spoken to the site administrator? Have you gone through the process that we have laid out? Do we even know what the process is? Or do you think that the first thing you should do is call your congressman, for instance? Did you have something you want to add to that? Okay. Anything else on that topic?
So I think what I'm hearing is that not only will we ensure that what we're doing on any of these matters is in the bylaws, but that we'll take your suggestions regarding how we can effectively educate, support our community in this governance process, and how we can also continue to invite our community to use some of the other processes that may actually bring about that resolution quicker, realizing they may have other reasons for wanting to be here with you, and that's their prerogative, but that if it's about resolving issues, we can continue to emphasize that. We'll include that, looking back to our team, but we'll include that in our work. The only other thing, President Mintz, before we leave this, I'm looking at this kind of public comment and non-agendized comment sheet, and I think the other really important piece that is important, it needs to be clarified, is we're very clear here on why, as a board, you don't engage the non-agendized public comments. The one thing, though, that you sometimes do ask, and I try to be very limited in my approach to this because I think that a back and forth regarding non-agendized public comment means it's on the agenda. But sometimes when something is shared, that there's a concern about its truth or its accuracy from my or our perspective, you have sometimes leaned over and said, Superintendent, did you want to offer a comment on that because you were concerned about some aspect of what you hear? I'm grateful that you don't do that often because I think it shifts what its intention is, but there are times when that happens that I think it allows me at least to communicate a truth or a perspective from a staff realm that may be different than what is heard. But I think I wanted to clarify that because that question has crossed my desk from some of our community as well. Like, why do you comment sometimes and the board doesn't? It's within that vein. The other thing that I work really hard with my staff, our staff on, is that when people are addressing you, they're not addressing us. Because sometimes you might find that they're actually looking to one of us and not to you to respond. And sometimes just because we want to be respectful, you'll see somebody go to the microphone and answer. It's not that we don't want to answer, it's just not appropriate in this space. And so I just want you to know that that's something that I'm really clear with our team, that we don't get into back and forths with those who are bringing their voice forward because it's not appropriate. It's your meeting. It's not our meeting. And we're here to support the work that you do here. And so I'm sharing this as well for anyone in our community who might be participating, because sometimes I've heard, well, I asked you a question and you didn't answer. Well, because it's not appropriate for me to respond directly to you because that person is here to address the board. So I just wanted to offer those two thoughts.
I think the only balancing act there is when there is a point of clarification that can be responded to, or something that staff takes accountability for following up and letting people know. And in many cases, it's not just for the person who asked the question, but it's really for the whole audience to let them know that we are following up on these things. Because we might do it quietly, but everyone else is left with the impression that we're just sitting there with stone faces. So there is that balancing act of, recognizing that people do come to us with specific things that we really do need to follow up on. Just letting them know we'll do that.
Well, and I think it relates to the circumstance when someone has a concern, a very concerning concern, and they don't know what to do with it, and somebody tells them, go to the school board meeting. And so they come to the podium and they talk about something, truly alarming that happened to their child. And we're all like deer in the headlights, and staff is deer in the headlights, and everybody's heart is going out to them because it's a painful thing. The drama and human tension on those, we kind of have to, and quite often someone from staff will jump up and go talk to them. But I mean, those are the really hard ones where if we don't do anything, we look like we're stoned.
Yeah. But it also doesn't call for an engagement back and forth.
No,
right.
no.
At that
But
point
that's
in
where
time.
usually
Right.
John or someone from staff jumps in and says, we'll have someone contact you right away.
And the reason I raise it also, it's all about balancing, because I think we've heard this from Nimita a few times tonight. We have to be very cognizant that since we're not responding all the time, when do we respond? Why do we respond? And how narrow are those parameters? So somebody doesn't feel as though someone received voice, attention, acknowledgement, resolution, while someone else stepped away not having received that. So for me, I'm just putting out here to you and stating in this public space that I tend to only go there for the two reasons you've described. Something emerged that was in one of our schools that harmed somebody's child, and we can't deal with it in this forum. You might hear me say, I'd like executive director to connect with you so that we can better understand your concern. So I think that's an appropriate response, and I would do that 100% of the time. The only other time I would want to do that is when clearly something has been shared that unfortunately there may be a completely other truth to share as well, and it potentially impacts something very intense that might be causing our community alarm or tension or what have you. So in other words, I think it needs to be carefully done and um, as seldomly done.
Right.
Does that make
Hopefully,
sense?
hopefully not very often.
Yeah, I
And
just,
it's probably the kind of thing where we should let, whoever's president should just let you take the lead on that rather than turning to you, because if it doesn't hit that
Right.
threshold for you, we're not then putting
well,
you
what I
in
could
an
do is I could,
uncomfortable
because I
place.
sit next to the president, I could lean over and say, and again, it's still the president's decision. I could lean over to say, I can offer a comment if you wish. And then, I'll be careful not to do it often. And, you can decide even in that moment if it's appropriate that you would want me to do that or not, or any.
And I think there is a wooden thing between us, so I can't just kick you in the shin or anything.
No, can't do that.
But I think also that's where, I think that's also where it's valuable for people to provide their personal information so that we can get back to them. But that's separate.
Can I ask for some clarity? For some reason, I haven't been able to really fully understand this based on the way the meetings are run. So a non-agenda item, public comment, we don't respond unless, like you said, it's very specific situations and it's from you, not from us. When it's a agendized item, public comment, and someone comes up to the podium and they have a lot of questions and they ask all of those questions and they're expecting a response from staff, how does that work? Do we as a board or the board president, do we decide if you will answer those questions? Do you decide? It feels a little ambiguous to me. Is it something well, how does it work, I guess?
I'll tell you what I prefer in this seat. You can tell me if you want to do it that way, and then you can tell us if this is okay. Even though I love to respond to our community, in this space, I prefer, not because I'm being disrespectful, that you are asking the questions of clarification of staff, just so to keep kind of a balance of things. So if you feel that something emerged through any comment that you would like to know more about, and then you say, Superintendent, it came up in one of the comments, and I'm wondering as well, that I think just provides a rhythm and a balance that is important. If none of you want a clarification on that, that's your prerogative as well. And I don't want to assume that you want a clarification on that. That's where I try to watch my own boundaries in meeting space. So that's kind of my preference. But does that align with what you prefer or want? Is that fair from a?
So, and I guess just to get clarity so that I have an understanding, so that the communication pathway, if you will, I'm just breaking it down so that it's completely clear, is that a person of the public in their public comment, they ask 3 questions in their commentary. Then we as a board, one of us, and maybe led by the president, but it probably doesn't matter, can then turn to you and say, Dr. Malloy, would you please answer this, question A, question B, whatever we feel we need the information for. Is that how that works?
In my mind, it happens when the public comments are finished. The president is facilitating the meeting. You're all having discussion, asking questions,
Okay.
dialogue, and in
So
that
it's
time-
not in response to the public comment. Okay. So it's not in response to there. Mhm. Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and so it's not it's the public comment time is happening, and then once all of the public comment time is over, then that's when we have an opportunity to identify their question, I guess, if you will. And also, would there be opportunity for us to be able to say, maybe it's questions that aren't really necessarily that we necessarily need answered for our decision, but that they need answered for their understanding that we offer, please submit your questions to Dr. Malloy's office and his staff will answer them directly.
But that's where I was really clear about what we've had to do, unfortunately, in the face of some pretty challenging questions that we've gotten. If it's an answer that we can provide or for clarification, we'll do it. If it's easy for us to pull together whatever it is, I promise we will. But some of those questions that come to us would need staff time to create, to research it. And unless you're directing that, we're not saying yes unless it's a public record. And I'm only saying that because to all that you're speaking about, it's not trying to be disengaging. It's just there's only so much time in the day. And your role, as you know, is to direct our work.
So it's like we're a filter.
Yeah.
For your questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ones that are easy, could you
Yeah,
clarify?
absolutely.
And you don't have to be many, even though the answers are, could you clarify, or could you expand upon that? But the ones that are honestly there as rhetorical questions,
Yeah.
you guys don't need the
Well, and yes, and
month's worth of work to go research the rhetorical questions.
and there are some there you've already given a pretty clear direction around. So to send it to staff to answer more questions when you've already publicly given clear direction around it, again, I will always promise our staff will be hospitable. It's just there's no ability for us to do something different than you may have already done. So yes to your answer, to your question, but with that caveat.
Oh, I understand. That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for clarifying because I wasn't clear, which tells me that most of our community probably isn't clear. And so it again comes down to education.
And I would suspect that there are times too that even right there's a point of clarification that can be answered very quickly and easily. As opposed to, yes, I think in general, though, the question should wait until it comes back to us for discussion.
But this is where the ambiguity kind of happens,
that's-
right? If we're answering some questions, because this is my experience. We answer some questions and not all, and then and so where are the guardrails? So yeah.
To me, that becomes a facilitation question of what makes sense in terms of, it is something right now as opposed to something that the board may or may not want an answer to. And I think that's what it comes down to is what does the board need in terms of its decision-making process that meets the questions that are coming at us from the community. The other part to that is how strongly we hold to our rules of order too. Even with our switch from Robert's rules, we still handle it pretty loosely. A lot of what we do, we should even be saying through the chair, asking a question of staff, for instance. We don't do that. But at the same time, there could be a sense that, we're more, like we said before, more like the PTA meeting in terms of how we handle things. So everyone feels that they can be engaging with us the same way, that we're open to getting into a dialogue and a debate with the public on these things. So that's something that we as a board have to consider, how strongly we want to be meeting the rules of how we engage as a meeting body. And that's kind of the message we send to the community as well. And it's a balancing act.
And President Mintz, the only thing I'll say is because for the most part, our board and community, even at the tense times, work effectively together. The adherence to rules, bylaws rigidly oftentimes must be used when there's conflict of deep nature. The only trouble is if you don't balance it and don't use your bylaws, why are you only using them when things might be tougher? And that's where I think what these discussions are helping me in my role in relationship to you is finding that balance is probably important because we're not just operating with what's happening today. Maybe what's happening next year or the year after or what have you. And you can't, just pick and choose when that bylaw is going to work because whoever is then impacted negatively by that will say, why did you do it now? So that's kind of what I think we're trying to do with how do you have bylaws that are effective, that are used, but are also engaging and respectful and hospitable. And I think that's been probably the takeaway from my listening to you the last hour.
So as we're coming up on another 13 minutes or so here. The item that you brought up was schedule of board meetings.
Yes.
And we had a little bit on that, but
Yes, I'd love to just offer a few comments. One of the things that I asked our team to do was to look at all of our requirements, state of California, county, all of your requirements when you have board business that has to happen at certain times. And what would a realistic schedule of meetings be that would allow us to fulfill all of those things? That was point number one. Point number two, when we look at our agenda items, and you saw an example of this last meeting where there was a California compliance strategy that we were able to bring in everything to do with our intervention work, for example. That was something that we're going to do more of so that we are bringing reports to you that don't look like isolated initiatives, but actually components of our strategic plan, which means that that's our staff job in relationship to you because you provide oversight to so that we're accountable how that works. And we're getting tighter with that particular piece. The other thing, as I shared earlier, that we're finding is that when our meetings are too close together, we never get off the very important cycle of we're just finishing one and we're already preparing for the next. And again, we probably can do a better job because I don't think your time or our community's time for some of those packages allows you to get through hundreds of pages. But obviously, those hundreds of pages are actually created by people. And so we're finding that that is impacting, especially on the ed services side of the house, the ability to be present in schools and to do some of the other work that's required. So the reason, and then we actually studied all the districts around us who has between, everyone has between like 12 and 16 meetings kind of thing. And so that was also part of the equation. So it's about strategic use of time. It's about fulfilling board state, county, and of course your job's expectations. It's also about balancing our time because of what preparation for a board meeting requires. That I propose this for your discussion, and if you're open to it, we would have to bring it to a board meeting because this is a different plan than what you have already approved for next school year. So that's, it's a conversation that my team and I have had. I wanted to bring it to you because it's common for us to kind of struggle with the balance of time piece. And we are totally fine with whatever you decide. But I just thought it was important for me to bring it to you because it's become so much a part of our discussions regarding that balancing of time and how we effectively engage and how we do our work with you and for our community and kids the best way possible. So, and one last comment, because I know that this has been asked of me. Following proper process, if something were ever to happen where something looked too long in terms of an agenda or something happened that we couldn't even predict, we can always put an item, a date on the calendar with the proper notice and all the rest. It doesn't even have to be an emergency meeting. We can just decide we need another meeting in March, and then 2 weeks after the one that's scheduled, we just can put it in. So it's not as though we are bound as long as we follow proper process if there was a need for whatever reason we can't predict for another meeting to happen. So it's over to you. That's the introduction.
Well, and I think too with this that we need to pair this with our advocacy and communication plan, in that we need to make sure that we're providing opportunities for our community to be able to reach out to us and for us to be able to reach out to them and hear from them and speak to them. And so I think that that connecting the two, I think, is important, so that we can do our business at our board meetings and provide an opportunity for public comment and for the public to come and speak to us, but also make sure as we're reducing the number of opportunities that they have to come before us as a board, we're creating more opportunities for them to come before us as board members. So with that advocacy plan and that communication plan. So
Thank you for connecting that dot. I was remembering to do it and I didn't. That's very important part of this.
so when I look at what was listed as a draft for 22-23 of 12 meetings, so basically moving to basically one per month. And the question that comes to mind and brought up earlier is, will this elongate our meetings? because of the number of items that we have to cover in a particular evening, particularly when something occurs that, expands the amount of public input that we receive on that particular night. So if we've got something that comes up, and, for the last several years, most of our topics that have taken a lot of time have been more social impact items rather than normal board business around academics or facilities or budget. So just trying to figure out how do we do that. One possibility would be to incorporate into the calendar another set of meetings that, if needed, would be held, but only if needed. And we would know that probably the meeting before. So just some way that we can balance it out to make sure
Right.
that we're not putting so much strain, because it also puts strain on staff if we're meeting until midnight or later.
Well, two things, just to be clear, this plan is only 2 meetings different than what's already been approved. So we're not talking about something massive that way. I wouldn't want to start putting all kinds of other placeholders in when we've already got ourselves to, I think, a rhythm that works. And if you're more comfortable keeping the way it is, then that's important to note. The other thing that has been discussed informally, and I know there are some concerns around people who commute and so forth, but that starting our meetings, in fact, our policy says we start at 6 o'clock, by the way. Just putting that out there because that came from yeah.
And that's from pre-1990.
Yeah. But we have had some conversation about, not wanting to exclude anybody, but moving the meeting earlier as well, because it's not as though I've heard a lot of complaints that a board meeting goes for 4 hours. It's a board meeting that goes for 4 hours, that goes to 11 o'clock at night. I mean, a lot of boards that we're all on, sometimes depending upon the business, that's not outlandish for a board meeting to be that long. I think our problem is when we start to get into the later hours.
Well, and we do have closed sessions that are sometimes 2 hours.
Yeah.
I personally think that's doable, and if this is really only 2 meetings fewer than 4, I think it should work, because, I mean, if we think about the things we're talking about that take up the extra time, you're just gathering fewer times. So if the business, it seems like it should work.
Yeah.
Might be fewer reports to the board overall, but
Well, and to
sounds
that,
like you're being really thoughtful and intentional about when and how to do reports, so maybe it all ends up being more streamlined anyway.
well, part of the work plan is when one of you says, I'd like to know more about, then I say to our team, incorporate that into the special education report, incorporate that into the deep learning report. In other words, you probably have noticed that we're moving away where we can from individual reports without trying to build them into the collective whole. And then I think you're going to see next, because I know we're working on it, how we're getting into a way of presenting, what does the data say? What are we doing next? Why are we doing it? What happened? So that we're not just telling a story of which some of the pieces people may not either want to hear or frankly think is too much. So we're trying to get to a place where our reports are tighter as well. So these are also, and if it doesn't work, we just have to put a meeting in. I mean, it's like that's kind of what our thinking is. But at least if we try it, it's kind of like when you're asked to do an essay that's only 2 pages as opposed to 10. It's hard to do the 2-pager because it actually takes a lot more thinking. That's on us to try to work in that way. And we are, as a team, embracing that.
Well, sorry.
I was just going to say, the one place that I'm seeing here that we might want to reconsider, and that's not meeting until August 16th. We've, in the past, always had a meeting the first week in August.
Can we talk about that?
And that meeting was always because of staff changes before school started. And the 16th would be when school's already underway.
So that one actually is the one we wanted out the most. And it's not in the one you approved, just so you know. You've already approved that one's gone. I didn't take that out for this one. When we looked at what actually has to be approved before school starts, that again is a cultural piece. We checked with the ed code and all the rest. The issue is that we've already got someone lined up to be the principal. way before August 5th. They've already left their job. Okay, so this is where we get into that thing of you have to ratify decisions, but if you were to say no, that person's already here because they don't wait until August 5th to tell their board they're not coming to be our principal. Okay, so when we interrogated that one a little bit, that's where there is no staffing decision that you're making on the 5th that the person hasn't already left their employ to be here because school's starting next week. And so to that point, what I've said to our team is, we've got to be sure that we get our hiring done by June. And where there is something that's outside of our control, then we're into that situation where if you were to say no on August 5th, we'd have a huge challenge because they're here already. And I'm thinking about some of the ones we did on August 5th last meeting. Others that don't need to be here already because we're hiring them to the technology department. Well, then don't tell your employer because you're not coming over until the 16th, if that is the case. So when we talked about that from a staff perspective, I hear what you're saying. It is past practice. It is cultural. But when we're talking about what truly happens, that principal's not waiting for August 5th to tell their board. That's the truth. I mean, I
Well,
know.
it's just, not just that it was past practice, but it seemed to be something that was needed each year. And that's only a question I'd have for you and staff. If you feel it's not needed, then.
I'm only smiling because being the newer person, I go with a dog with a bone. Tell me why we do that. Tell me where that comes from. So everything that's behind this has already been deeply studied, or I wouldn't be as confident in the way I responded to you. Because I'm saying this doesn't make sense. They're here already. Like the principal is here already. Help me understand August 5th. So this was the discussion that we had as a staff when I was just trying to better understand the practice, only to find out that the disconnect was that, yes, you do have a role to ratify that decision. But the trouble is that when you're talking about the start of school, those people aren't holding on to their old job, waiting for you at the beginning of August to approve, especially if they happen to be school-based, especially if they happen to be leadership. So that's where I think the disconnect was, because I was puzzled at first. We dug deeply, we looked at legal stuff, and that's why, and frankly, we're one of the only boards left in the entire area that does an early August meeting. That was the first thing that tipped me off. Why are we doing this when nobody else is doing this? And that's, Ken, where I was able to speak with this.
Well, the other interesting thing is, as I said, it's been a practice for a long time to have, and it's even a morning meeting that first week in August, I think, except for this past year. And that's when school was starting a whole lot later in August as well. So the question I would have, is it a meeting in July, or it's hard to imagine that we have everything worked out by June 13th.
All I can tell you
is
is,
there a need for a July meeting? I just want to make sure that we're not faced with a situation where one of two things: either we have to call an emergency meeting in the middle of summer, or, and this is more of a board issue, that we as a board aren't ratifying what we believe we should be ratifying. That I don't want to see our ratifications, and we've had this discussion on another topic, turn into just a rubber stamp. That if it's a ratification, we need to treat it as a ratification. And management positions haven't been that way. So that's the part that I'm trying to balance in my mind. Maybe it's not the beginning of August, but maybe it's something after June 13th also.
well, to be honest, again, I'm asking the board to consider there's got to be a break. There's just got to be a break for a couple of weeks. And as I said, in studying this, unless there's an emergency, like when COVID demanded a July emergency meeting, districts don't have July meetings anywhere around us. So again, I'm understanding past practice, and I get what you're saying as well. But I also want to balance, if I can, the fact that we only have, when you think about the June meeting and the start of school, which is, for us, our principals start coming back by July 10th, the secondary ones, for example. There's not a lot of a window there. So that's what I'm also asking the board's consideration. Any thoughts on this, Namita, from your perspective, because you work with districts all up and down?
Yeah, I think I completely understand the president's perspective and concern, but the reality is for an administrator to become a administrator here in San Ramon Valley, the last day in their job would be June 30th, 20, of the year, and they would be starting here July 1 in order to get service credit. Most administrative positions interviews happen during the school year because that's where you have the best the best applicant pool. So really what you're talking about is that one-off situation where somebody had a health issue and decided at the last minute that they are not going to return as an administrator and you need to fill that position. But for that, in that one-off situation, we could have a special meeting with 24 hours Brown Act notice. And districts do that. The only prohibition around hiring at a special meeting is if you're hiring someone who is in the superintendent rank, so assistant soups. That is what is prohibited by the code. But anything else, you can do a special meeting with 24-hour Brown Act notice, and you can approve that. Most districts in California don't have a July meeting. I think the option to assuage some of your concerns is maybe, and again, I'm not modifying the proposed calendar, but maybe go 1 week later in June. So you are still looking at June because it allows you to maybe non-reelect a few other employees, first-year probes, if that is an issue in some districts. So maybe there is some leeway there, but theoretically, there is nothing that would require an early August meeting. I mean, as I hear around hiring.
And we did study that a second week of June meeting gives us all of the right opportunities for any of the non-reelects and all of that. So the takeaway for me is, I think that we can limit any type of major hiring in that window that might have required August 5th. Even when we have an emergency principal leave, we don't normally have the ability to interview in the middle of July and get candidates anyhow. So it usually means starting the year with some type of retirement placement and such. So I think that the balance would be, we won't be doing, like I said, we'll do our very best to ensure that everything is staffed and ready to go by the last meeting. So there is a true board approval of that. In the window that doesn't have a meeting, we won't do that work unless absolutely necessary. And if there is something that's absolutely necessary that isn't at the level of superintendent, assistant superintendent, then we ask to do a special meeting. And if I'm not mistaken, board members even could be remote for a special meeting. At least some could be if that was necessary, right?
As long as a forum is
Yeah.
within the boundaries, we could have it teleconference, as long as the posting requirements.
Right, there's a whole bunch of rules I've learned about. So if we had to do it, we could.
Door of your hotel
Yeah.
room.
In your room, in your house.
Can I ask a different topic question? So will we also be having board workshops like this? And I guess I would ask specifically, like, how would a annual review of strategic directions fit into this calendar? Would that be a workshop, or would that be fit into, I'm just curious about how that all works.
So two thoughts. One is, I think that probably getting into our schedule so that we're not rushing to figure out when and where, maybe a quarterly or something, you can discuss where we actually set a date, even if the topics that we want to engage at that meeting haven't been set yet. So I just think that's a good operational thing to do. I've always experienced where we, put one in October and one in whatever and figure that out. Secondly, strategic directions, I see two things happening. The purpose of the strategic reports is to provide an annual cyclical report on one component of that strategic directions. Where there is also a value, and I think it's also good for our community to see how we're telling that more collective story, not specific to deep learning or equity or what have you, that probably goes kind of to the, if I can use this term, 10,000-foot level, as opposed to what the individual reports sometimes dive deeply into. That's also good from a communication perspective to engage our community. Now, whether we have that conversation at a workshop, which certainly could be a valid way to have this kind of free-flowing discussion, that then would allow us to create some communication tools based upon that conversation, because in that sense, you'd already have provided your oversight in the component part. So it's not like we need a board meeting for you to give direction, but it allows you to engage us have staff present, any of our community who's interested. I certainly like the idea of doing that at one workshop a year, if that's what your interest is.
I'm interested.
I mean,
Yeah.
And I think from an accountability standpoint too, really to be able to look at the whole picture, and see how it's all, like you said, how it's all working together, I think would be extremely valuable. And I also find that this type of a forum is a great place to be able to really dig deep into those more conceptual philosophical issues as opposed to just one action item after another. We do have that conversational aspect with this forum, so I find it very valuable.
and the only thing I'd suggest is that early fall is the placement of it, not what a lot of people do, which is May. Because the team in May would benefit from some different working opportunities in the summer to create something for that type of workshop in early fall. I don't know why, as educators, we always think that everything has to be done before summer. But I've learned that that early fall for a workshop like that, standard every year, is probably the best placement for it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. At the same time, the public sees us as the representatives. And as we talk about the beginning of this meeting, finding ways of engaging more, I just want to make sure we're not engaging less from a more formal structure as we say we're going to be out there more. So it's a balance once again. I've used the term several times. It's a balancing act. I'm fine with it, but I'm really interested to see how it works in terms of the public engagement of our meetings, as well as the length of our meetings and what we actually accomplish with them going forward. So
We can see where it goes.
okay. Was there anything else that I?
Yeah, I just had one comment,
Okay,
and
come on.
that is that I'm totally willing to try it. I had the same concern as Ken did, and I expressed it to you about having less meetings and then the meetings going longer. That being said, if I depend on you and your staff to be able to ascertain what the workload is and how you want to dispense it or how it would work the best. I don't have really a feel for that other than what I see on the finished agendas. So I would want to definitely try that. I think with the engagement piece with the community, I'm hoping that if we have less meetings, as we work with our advocacy and communication, and we have this long list of places that we want to put ourselves and communication we want to have with our community, that will somehow offset maybe not being in the meeting center, the meeting formally. So, because I'm interested in doing more of that, and, the meetings are important for get our business done, but it's not always the most conducive place to collaboration.
And I know we're running out of time, but for example, I was with PTA today, and I said to them that, wouldn't it be amazing if all the schools were your liaison and the supervisor can actually facilitate that strategic directions conversation that I started in the big room with the presidents today, or we talked about with the advocacy for funding, you and the PTA president at that particular school getting some support to be at all of our 36 sites, actually having rich dialogue around kind of that important topic. Those, I think, are kind of, we talked balance all the last 3 hours. That's just balancing the different strategies that can be used. But in terms of this, we need to bring this back to a board meeting. And when we bring it back, is it okay to propose an earlier start time, or are you worried about that?
Well, let me adjust that real quick. So going way back, we met at 7:30. And then we switched to 7 o'clock to be earlier. The one thing that's changed significantly the last few years is the amount of time we are spending in closed session. And I couldn't give you exact timing. However, something that always kind of found funny was our practice, and Cindy will smile when I say this, our practice was if we start at 6 o'clock, that's fine. If we start at 5:30, we'd have sandwiches or something because we were going to be there at 5:30, even 5:30, I think there'd be something. Doing that a whole lot initially, and more of our work, because of litigation issues, because of negotiation issues, we as a board spend almost as much time in closed session these days as we do in open session. And that, I think, and it wasn't until Shelley was talking that I really was thinking about that, is whether this will allow enough closed session opportunity for the kind of discussions that we have to have on an ongoing basis. So it's not as much as I think more and more about, it's not the public meeting, but it really is the closed session, closed meeting type of responsibilities that we have as well, that we have to make sure that we're accountable for with a monthly basis. So that's something to, I think, consider. 6 o'clock, I don't have a feeling one way or the other what time we start, because we're already here by 5:30. So, if it means we're going to have to start at like 4 o'clock on a closed session, that's what we'll probably need to consider for some of us.
Well, I think similar to the strategic reports, and I know we've run out of time, I also think now that I've been here for considerably enough amount of time, it's usually litigation and negotiations that take up that closed agenda. And I think that from a staff perspective, we can tighten up the information we provide to you so that you can have all of it and you can engage it and you can dialogue about it and do what you need with it. I think that from my seat, I'm not in any way critiquing the amazing team I get to work with, but I think we can tighten up some things. And so let me think about that with them, so that if we do propose 6 and you say yes to that, we aren't actually, as an unintended consequence, starting you at 3:30. Like, that's just not going to help your being able to make good decisions at 9:30. So I'll work with the team on that.
Yeah, and I find just in my year that it feels like with closed session, oftentimes we just use the time that we have. So if we have 2 hours, we use the full 2 hours. If we have an hour, we use the hour. And it's only been a couple of, like with negotiations where we've come back and circled back, and a few other things that we've had to kind of circle back because we ran out of time, and those were more in-depth conversational type of things that we had to discuss. So that's just an observation that I wanted to point out.
I think that's true, but I also think that when we run into it, we
Yeah.
so that there's also sort of a certain amount of with these dates, I'm okay with being on February 14th, but I do wonder if we might have some community feedback about February 14th. I'm okay, but I just think we ought to put it out there that
Is that a problem?
it's really more.
It's not, but I think, yeah, the public, yeah.
Yeah.
I think for the public, if there's a way to shift it, but I don't know if there is, but.
Okay, we'll take a look at that before we.
All right. Anything else? In that case, we do have moving on our agenda, then we do have a public comment. Public comments are only on item 4.1, not non-agendized items. I've got one. Helen, is this you? Helen?
My name is Taiwan's the country. That's
Okay,
spelled
that's the name of
Tywon
your-
because in the past there has been people who imposter as me. So I would like to formally introduce myself. Taiwan, the country. Thank you. I would like to address the board after sitting here for 3 hours. You have all missed why we have public meetings. Public meetings are not social gatherings. The objectives for public meetings, besides for the board to conduct business, it is also means for the public to be involved in the government policy making decision that impacts them. The government has no right, like what you just did, to modify the public meeting rules to deprive the public's rights to know what the board business are. You won't allow yellow cards now after presentation. So people who are running late coming from work don't even stand a chance. You won't allow pulling consent agenda without giving rationale. Are you doing think control? Who gives you the right to do so? Public meetings also serves for an opportunity for the public to ask questions and comment on the board business. Now you won't answer, even if it's agenda items. Judge, it also allows the public to judge the public can or cannot say now, so that now we can even say what we want to say, even if we come here. You're doing speech censorship, and sometimes literally you have pulled my mic in the past. You guys spent a whopping 4 hours to make what makes United States of America unique as a free and democratic society with government transparency and public involvement into an authoritarian government where government secretly spend tax dollars to oblivion by money laundering and oppress citizens with unreasonable and unlawful mandates and policies. Once a month meeting, of course, you will now have midnight meetings because you're cramming two into one. Brilliant communists you are. I'm so sorry. My condolences to the death of the United States of America, to the death of democracy and freedom.
Okay. Any other comments? And Cindy, we didn't receive any comments for this meeting. Okay, was there?
Oh, it came to your email. See, she knows best. Sorry.
Okay.
Oh.
In that case, we're adjourned.
Okay.
Thank you all for your time.
Sorry
this
about that.
afternoon.
It's just I didn't want